His youngest daughter flew to Piersag's arms, calling out uncle. However, she suddenly screamed in pain and fled, covering her chest with her arms. She had been pinched. Menta's wife and sister turned pallid with horror. "My lord, you..." The knight had been close to Piersag, at least in the past. Now. Screams and cries rang out from the women in the room, but after some loud whips they were muted into low weeps. Piersag's growls and pants, on the other hand, grew louder and louder. Two knights stood tall outside the door, just like metal statues as their cold eyes swept across the dark and gloomy corridor. They were ready to drive anyone who dared even come close away. Back at the reconnaissance base, Richard was carefully inserting a magic needle into the lock on Eshen's diary. He infused mana into its body, causing the seal to glow with a green flame before it completely dimmed. A snap sounded out, and the lock was opened. Richard smiled gently, satisfied with the results he'd had in a short period of time. He'd revised his theory on several special magical formations in the process, and also obtained a clearer understanding of the standard of magic in this plane. He also managed to grasp the differences between here and Norland, which would allow him to build runes with local materials in the future. There wasn't much in the diary, and it only recorded the most significant events in Eshen's life. The writing was vigorous and powerful, exuding an atmosphere of piety. He'd recorded an incident that occurred when he'd first joined the church, 15 years ago. An old level 5 cleric had fallen, seduced by the devils. He'd cast a forbidden summoning spell to save the life of a bastard child, building an altar to the devil in his own basement. However, he'd only just traded his soul away when he was caught by the church, eventually sent to the gallows. The child and her mother were put into the Lord's dungeons as well, tortured to death. However, there had been an accident when they tried to destroy the altar. The devil summoned by the old cleric turned out to be very powerful, and although its main body could not pass through the portal, it had tossed 2 imps out. These imps were not weak, and 6 knights were sacrificed to kill them. Eshen himself had been bitten, but thankfully he had enough divine power to resist and eventually dispel the corrosive power. He'd thus managed to avoid his own fall. Eshen had noted his concerns at the end of that incident in his diary. Those imps were only the most basic of creatures in hell, but even suppressed by this plane's laws they managed to make the church's elites pay a heavy price. If someone managed to build a stable portal to hell, wouldn't it spell a catastrophe for the entire plane? Gods could not meet every worshipper's prayers, and it was impossible to fulfill everyone's desires. The old cleric was just one example. However, Eshen knew that there were more people who sold their souls for health, power, and money, not to mention eternal life. This was a temptation nobody could resist, not even him. It was just that his knowledge as a cleric was far more profound than that of the commoners. Devils themselves were not immortal beings, so how could they give other creatures eternal life? However, the worshippers of a god could enter their kingdoms after death, and that would be true eternal life. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 46. History. The diary pages after the incident recorded Eshen's interest in the plains. He'd pored through many tomes and books, even abusing his position to study taboo scriptures. He pinned down his inspirations in the diary, and his research indicated there was more than just one planar invasion. The effects of these invaders varied, as did their forms. Not many were human, but human invaders weren't particularly rare, either. The oracles from the god of valor and other gods did not have much information about planar invasions, but there were still some traces. 2 important factors were sent down with these oracles: their strength, and their numbers. Insignificant invasions like Richard's, where the aggressors were level 10 or below, were extremely rare. Only one such incident had occurred before. Those under level 13 were classified as a mild threat, while those who reached level 15 were considerably dangerous. As for those past that point, they were considered extremely dangerous. The numbers didn't matter as much, as their levels often defined their power. Even the largest group of invaders had only numbered close to 100, so the numbers of the invaders were rarely mentioned. Throughout history, none of these invaders could compare to the gods of the plane. Any of the experts within the plane could exterminate all of them single-handedly, but they often left it for the lower strata to deal with. However, there was one exception. 3 astral beasts had invaded from a foreign plane, and after a devastating battle almost all the experts of the plane had perished. Even one of the deities themselves had fallen, and the northwest of the continent had been separated from the rest, drifting towards the seas and turning into a lone island. It took great sacrifice to slay the 3 beasts and destroy the portal connecting to the other plane. The gods had kept mum about the truth of the matter, and no further probes could be made. Even the most secret of holy tomes only mentioned it in passing. At the end of it all, Eshin had written down a simple line: "Are planar wars inescapable?" That doubt had come 12 years after he'd begun his research into other planes. Level 16 offered an intrinsic change in this plane. Regardless of class, mages turned into grand mages, warriors became saint warriors, and priests became high priests. Eshin was only above average as a priest, and it was unknown whether he could cross level 16 in his lifetime. But this short, succinct diary proved to Richard that he was no ordinary person. He was a genius, his intelligence far surpassing his faith. The diary entries from the past year noted that the priest had begun a search for relics of ancient times. That was why he'd come to manage a church at the edges of the White Rock Duchy. The land of turmoil was nearby, in the mountains that Richard's base had wound up in. The land of turmoil spanned great swaths of land, more than 10,000 square kilometers in area, with only the edges settled. The place was extremely dangerous, with tall mountains, steep cliffs, deep ravines, and ridges being common sights. There were few humans nearby, with mostly powerful beasts roaming the lands. The land of turmoil was wedged between the fertile plains and the Red Rock Highlands, capped off by the bloodstained lands to the north. Spacetime ripples weren't uncommon here, and foreign creatures regularly drifted in from the rifts. It was unknown how many foreign species had made this place their home, and Eshin wanted to find vestiges of the tear in the void caused by the rifts they'd come here through. He wanted to use those traces to unravel the mystery of the planes. The priest had vast ambitions. He wanted to discover the essence of planes and time, finding a method to link to other planes. He'd realized that the planes overall might have dwindled from invasion to invasion, and also guessed that this signified that the gods were growing weaker as well. The deities would send out oracles for every batch of invaders, and the stronger the enemies, the more information was provided. They had to consume a great amount of energy to even make these prophecies, and for them to be clear required inordinate amounts. The withering powers in this plane was proof of his assumptions. The plane had yet to recover to its peak from before the battle with those astral beasts, and even to this day was a third away from its former heights. What's worse, no new god had replaced the one that had fallen. No churches had been formed in recent years, and even the chosen, saints, and petitioners of the old ones had not recuperated. In the 13th year of his search, Eshin had finally come up with a new conjecture: this was not the only plane with gods in it. Such thinking was extremely taboo under the teachings of the gods. If his diary was leaked, he would definitely be burnt at the stake. He believed that since war was inevitable between the myriad planes, then resources and power were paramount. One had to think of a way to open portals to another plane if they wished to break this deadlock, invading them successfully. Stealing the wealth, resources, and talents of those planes would be the only way to strengthen their own. It was also the only way to ensure that their power would not regress further. All this information left Richard speechless. According to the gods, this plane was known as Failure. Richard gathered from the diary's information that, more often than not, these invaders were people who'd accidentally wound up here through the rifts in spacetime. They didn't originally intend to conquer it. As for the astral beasts, they were likely powerful beings that could open portals in spacetime and travel the myriad planes themselves, like his own master, Sharon. Interplanar wars were already deep-rooted within the psyche of Norland's inhabitant. Any family that had stood the tests of time had at least one plane's resources backing them. Because of this, wars in Norland far exceeded those in these secondary planes in scale. The first time Richard met Gatton, this marquis had been allocating tasks to nibble away at a certain plane. Due to the importance of interplanar war, those matters were extremely complicated. They needed a standard battle plan from the moment of infiltration, inclusive of their setup and expansion all the way to total conquest. Thus, even in Norland only the upper echelons of society were involved with interplanar wars. Theory and tactics on such conquest only spread through the inner circles of nobility, and commoners would never be privy to such information. Richard's own knowledge came from Gatton's study, and all his actions had been an attempt to adapt the theory he'd learnt to practice. Put bluntly, he was far from devising his own unique methodology to conquer planes. Eshin had discovered the pressing importance of interplanar war without even experiencing a proper war and failure himself. To call him a genius would be a shame. His foresight was acute, and he managed to derive great visions of the future from small details. If time permitted, he could very well have become an influential figure that brought forth a revolution. However, he was just a priest. Every time Richard thought of this point, he could only lament in pity. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 47. Holding. Eshin's main weakness was his lack of power. He needed to be the Pope of the Church of Valor at minimum to influence history, and even then realizing his wishes would only be a mild possibility. Popes were normally level 18, in order to suppress the cardinals who ranged from level 16 to 17. Level 17 high priests could possibly become popes, barely containing their cardinals, but that was the limit. Even level 16 would be too far-fetched, and after their fight Richard knew the priest would be lucky to get to even 15. Even more important was that Eshin had secretly conducted research into the taboo of planes in spacetime, so Nyan didn't favor him as much as he would otherwise, stumping his growth. Thus, this priest who had pried open the door to the mysteries of the endless planes would forever disappear into the sands of time as someone insignificant. The real reason for the seal on the diary was that he had foreseen his death, and one day before it he planned to activate the destruction magic so this book that he'd poured blood and sweat into would disappear from the plane alongside him. However, things didn't always go according to plan. Eshin could never have guessed that Richard would boldly barge into Forza's lands and attack the Church of Valor. His diary had thus fallen into the invaders' hands, and what's more, this was a rune master with an extremely strong foundation. Richard easily dismantled the seal, which otherwise couldn't have been broken in failure. Rather surprisingly, Richard discovered the heritage of the indestructible page at the end of the diary. It was something that belonged to a divine being from another plane, found by an adventurer in some ruins. It was from the Book of Holding, of which Eshin had recorded there were a total of 9 pages. Once all 9 pages were found, the book could be reformed and completed, and it was rumored that a part of the book's powers could be realized for every 2 pages assembled. Even Eshin did not know what the completed book would grant its wielder, even including the one Richard had found. The Church of Valor only had 2 pages. These pages only appeared randomly during rifts in spacetime. Nobody knew who they belonged to or where they came from, nor why the book was damaged or what sort of existence created it. This single page could store a single spell of grade 6 or below, and only for a month. However, it could be used repeatedly. A single page wasn't useful for much else, needing 2 to activate at least part of the book's powers, but for Richard, who was about to advance to level 9, it was an extremely powerful magic tool. It was akin to having an extra instance of his strongest spell, increasing his combat power by 1/3. Richard officially broke through to level 9 the day after breaking the seal on Eshin's diary. After some thought, he decided to upgrade Nature's Beacon to grade 5. The spell could be upgraded all the way to grade 9, summoning a different creature every time. Richard took less than half a day to master the upgraded spell, after which he took out the page and studied it. This page seemed different from regular magic scrolls. The spell wasn't written onto it, and the page instead served as a container. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he thought of the books he had browsed through in the deep blue. Some intelligent species did not use words to communicate, instead talking through runes or even spiritual force. Perhaps this page he'd found from Eshin had been made by one such species. Having studied it for some time, Richard decided to experiment. He held the page in his hand as he cast Nature's Beckon once. After a perfect incantation with no mistakes, he felt the elven blood in him come alive and the ivory bracelet radiate a current of warmth. The two powers fused into his body, assisting the formation of the grade 5 spell. It flashed in Richard's palms, but instead of being cast it entered the page of holding. An image of several lifelike direwolves appeared on the originally blank page. These creatures were the same as the boars, scale-like armor padding their backs and shoulders. However, their offensive power was greater, leading to a significant increase in battle prowess. Even drawn on the page they seemed awe-inspiring. However, Richard felt that something was amiss. He picked up the page and observed closer, counting a total of 5 wolves. Indeed, 5. Nature's Beckon always summoned anywhere between 1 and 3 familiars. With Richard's gifts, his incantations, hand movements, and mana transfer were perfect to the textbooks. His summons thus normally reached the upper limit of 3, and the buffs from his elven bloodline and the ivory bracelet pushed that to 4. However, now that he'd grown in level, there was one more creature in the summon. Richard replayed the spellcasting process in his mind once more, and determined that his elven bloodline had strengthened once more. The direwolves were equivalent to enhanced raptors, making Nature's Beckon the strongest spell for him at grade 5. However, he did not know if this buff would apply to other types of summons as well. If such a thing was possible, then the higher grades of summoning spells would be overpowered. The summoning of demons, wyverns, and golems were all powerful spells. However, as powerful as those summons were, the success rate of those spells were low. Even when cast, only one familiar would be summoned at most. If the buff worked on these spells, it would make for an absolute increase in strength. However, he would only know that after he advanced to level 13 or 14. However, he could attempt summon undead at his current level. Richard suppressed his excitement, immediately casting the spell. Sadly, only 3 skeletons were left dancing around the room after the flash of light, indicating that the buffs did not apply to undead. He calmed down and eventually snapped his fingers, dispelling the spell. Even just a buff for Nature's Beckon was more than enough. He sat down again, looking at the 5 wolves on the torn page as he finally allowed himself to feel a little proud. Ever since Gatton had mentioned that Sharon had a summoner's bloodline, he was eager to show her these spells. Even the legendary mage wouldn't be able to do better than 5 wolves at the same level, could she? Even with the addition of her bloodline, she would be able to summon 6 at most. Richard wondered, if his master saw his achievements today, would he earn a lot of Sharon's delight? For some reason or the other, the Knight of Destiny surfaced in his mind once more. That beautiful yet realistic dreamscape of the deep blue aria once again waltzed in the void, carrying his master's expectations. There were still many things he had to do. The promises he made to the 2 most important women in his life still required a great deal of work. Once he regained his calm, Richard stowed the page away and opened up his map, pondering about his next step. In fact, most of his theories about the buffs to his summoning were right, except that he got one thing wrong. In the scenario he'd imagined, Sharon's spell would be much more powerful than he thought. It would only be in the distant future, when he would see his teacher cast a legendary red dragon summon, that he would realize Sharon's gift had 3 unique properties. The first was an increase in familiars, the second was an increase of 1 to 3 grades of the creatures she summoned, and a mana reduction when casting summoning spells. Hence, if a level 9 Sharon were to face off against Richard and both of them were limited to Nature's Beckon, Richard's 5 wolves would be facing over a dozen dire bears. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 48. Coincidence. Richard marked a new spot on his map, indicating the projected location of the other invaders. Although he did not know which plane they had come from, they definitely were not friendly forces. It was more dangerous to join forces with another invader during a war than to ally with the natives themselves. Having deduced several possible paths to take, Richard fell into a bout of hesitation. No matter what, they had to forfeit their base. This position had been exposed far too long ago, and staying would bring a risk of death. However, they'd only return to pack supplies, confusing their opponents while they stalled for time. Richard's hesitation was not for that, he was wondering whether they should remain in Forza's lands for a longer period of time. If he could deal a heavy blow to Jalian's reinforcements, then the Baron's lands would have their doors wide open to give him anything he wanted. The castle definitely wouldn't be able to stop him and his ferocious party. But there was great risk in staying, the sort of risk that arose if one stayed in position too long in guerrilla warfare. The opponents would figure out the threat of his forces, analyzing and predicting their movements. After all, he was just an intruder in Phalar. Even if he came from a stronger plane with a better path to power, he had no allies. Right now, the most important thing to do was to determine the strength of the troops coming to aid Forza. He took out another map, one that marked the factions and powers in the White Rock Duchy. Under the White Rock Duke himself were a Marquis, 3 greater earls, 2 lesser ones, and over 50 barons. Jalian himself had a viscount, 4 barons, a powerful knight, and 2 great mages under him. And when Richard saw information on Pearsage, his eyes slightly constricted. Baron Pearsage was similar to Sir Menta, they were both powerful individuals who could also lead armies. Pearsage was a famed general in the entire duchy, and if he was the one leading the reinforcements, they would be impossible to defeat in one fell swoop. Richard's army definitely put him at a disadvantage. Even if regular soldiers were taken out of the equation, Pearsage was sure to have his own corps elites. A fight with the Baron would only end in a bitter victory that took out part of his army, unless he could find a suitable battleground and divide the man's forces. However, the probability of such a thing happening was far too low. Pearsage was a much better leader than Forza, which meant that Richard lost his edge both in elites and in leadership. Richard heaved a sigh of relief, dismissing the idea of taking out Forza's castle. The amount of wealth the Baron would have accumulated was tempting, but no matter how he thought it over, he didn't have much of a chance against the reinforcements. If Pearsage really was the one leading them, he would have no chance at all. He thus picked up his map and began to look at routes going to the northwest, tracing many such routes with his fingers. He followed the intersection between the Land of Turmoil and the Direwolf Duke's Sequoia Kingdom, before entering the desolate yet chaotic Bloodstained Lands. The Bloodstained Lands were an area where humans, barbarians, and the desert people mingled. There were patches of both barren and fertile land, with the terrain being quite hilly. There was a constant shortage of food, making it a den of thieves, criminals, and murderers that was a nightmare for the common man. Many criminal ringleaders and slave traders operated out of the place, treating all creatures as prey like hyenas. The place was chaotic and dyed in blood, but it suited Richard's current needs. As for Forza's lands, the seed had already been planted. He could harvest it whenever he was ready, and that time wasn't necessarily too distant. Richard did not know that an extremely intense battle had occurred nearby. It was where he'd marked the other invaders to arrive, a fair distance off his travel route. Tens of kilometers away from the Bloodstained Lands, a towering, strange portal stood tall as it flashed with vibrant light. Gravity was warped, many small objects floating in mid-air while others sank deep into the earth. Many images flashed in the rift formed by the portal, looking like several magical beasts. However, when these images contorted and disappeared, they turned out to be mere illusions. The portal was so massive the spacetime around it was warped. Black rifts were floating around everywhere, extremely dangerous tears in the fabric of space that could even cut a Saint Warrior from Norland in half. The portal expanded and contracted as several knights in heavy black armor leapt out. Each of them was of large build, looking extremely malevolent. Even the horses that they rode were very strange, as all of their bodies were black. Their fur was long and thick, with 2 canines on the side of their jaws. The surroundings of the portal were not peaceful at all, instead a vicious battlefield filled with shouts and slashes. Native warriors and paladins had already surrounded the portal, doing their best to destroy the Black Knights that were here to invade them. Behind the warriors were tens of priests and clerics, casting spells incessantly as their hands glowed with divine light, buffing the warriors under them. The buffs were equivalent to an extra level for these warriors, and they roared praises for their priests and hurled curses at the enemies. Even if the opponent plunged two swords into their bodies and they could feel the cold of the blades piercing their organs, they still wielded their weapons against these Black Knights. Everything would be worth it as long as they could injure these opponents in the slightest. They were brave unto death, and coupled with their sheer numbers their valor had great effect. The Black Knights were forced down from their horses, slain by a surging swarm of warriors. However, every death of a knight also made for 10 losses on their side, and those warhorses were extremely brutal as well. Even without their owners they ran free, trampling and charging down the battlefield if their owner was not dead. Their hooves and sharp teeth were fatal weapons, and one of them even ripped off an opponent's head and started to eat it in the middle of the battle. Such a terrifying sight scared the cowards, but the greater number were thoroughly enraged. A paladin howled loudly as he crashed into the warhorse's flank, plunging his sword deep into its heart. The black warhorses had a coat of extremely thick fur that could rival a direbear's defense, but the undaunted all-out attack was something that fur could not prevent. The warhorse neighed loudly like a savage beast, even as a dozen more weapons buried themselves into its body. Most only made about a dozen centimeters in, but some managed to get to its insides. The clobbered warhorse writhed, using its last dregs of strength as it moved forward and chomped down on a paladin. The creature's jaws had frightening power, disfiguring the knight's armor and smashing half the breastplate and a pauldron to smithereens as he wailed in agony. Even as each warrior gave their lives to the cause, the Black Knights were unbreakable like a reef in a current. They surged out of the portal endlessly, their front lines spreading wide to form a defensive line. As time passed, this line began to push forward. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 49. Coincidence, 2. At over 2.5 meters tall, these Black Knights were tall and built like beasts. Their warhorses were much larger than normal as well. Even at their height the knights were barely taller than their mounts. The 100-kilo greatswords and large halberds seemed weightless in their hands, as they swept through their opponents like whirlwinds without using the tips much at all. Every time one of their weapons touched something, it was completely decimated. When two old mages stepped out of the portal, the situation began to change. The moment they saw the situation, they instantly cast acid fog. What's more, the spells didn't avoid the Black Knights at all, but once the spells were cast, the sky was filled with large clouds of yellowish-green mist that enveloped almost half the battlefield. Screams rang out when it made contact with skin, and blisters started forming on all the enemies. The paladins roared out to bolster morale, trying their hardest to repel the acid fog with their energy. But ordinary soldiers, even those at level 6 or 7, did not possess the ability to do so. Bone-crushing pain begot cries of agony, sending the soldiers into disarray. Burnt by the acidic air, their eyes turned completely red. It stung so hard that they couldn't possibly open their eyes. On the other hand, the Black Knights glowed with energy as they nonchalantly forged past the mist. Their weapons left behind a rain of blood and flesh, while even their horses charged ahead without being affected at all. The area within the fog experienced a massacre. The priests in the distance were enraged, stomping their scepters into the ground with full force as they cast a curse. Divine light shot out of their fingertips, exploding into a blinding sphere of light at the destinations. The divine power brought forth a violent gust of wind that scattered most of the fog, but in that short period of time 10 knights and 2 paladins had been hacked to death. And even though the mist was blown away, those already tainted by the corrosion continued to suffer. The clerics grew increasingly busy as they continued to heal even as they purified the air, spells constantly shooting out of their hands. Alas, the battle seemed increasingly hopeless. The portal suddenly stopped for a few seconds, a strong ray of light seemingly bursting forth with a fog that was black as ink. The fog tossed and tumbled, and a few ferocious roars sounded out from within. The fog finally dissipated to reveal a female knight up in the air, riding a large black beast. She gently patted the creature on its neck, and it immediately stretched out and floated down to the ground. Only once it landed would people realize how large this beast truly was. It resembled a lion, with long sharp teeth protruding from its upper lips. Its mane flew majestically even without any wind, making it look incredibly mighty. Stood upright, it was even taller than the Black Knights, but its stance was unimaginably graceful. Black armor extended all along its back to its tail, the tip of which was like a scorpion's sting. The knight atop the beast would be considered petite by human standards, and atop a creature of its size she seemed like a little doll. She was dressed in black armor and cloak, with her eyes and hair being of the same color as well. She blended in perfectly with the knights and beast, but the style of her armor was quite unknown. Its defense and any other capabilities were unknown, but the design was even more revealing than that of Blood Paladin Senma. Outside of the gauntlets and boots, the armor covered even less than just underwear would. Outside of her breasts and 3 strategic thin leaves at the abdomen, she was almost naked. The woman had a lethargic expression on her face, as if she'd been woken from an intoxicating dream. She had a hand on the beast's mane, while the other was clenched into a tiny fist that she pressed against her lips as she let out a few lazy yawns. She opened seemingly perplexed eyes to study the surrounding area, immediately kicking the beast in the thigh to have it crouch. "What's going on?" Her voice was extremely gentle, so tender it was like she'd been woken up early in the morning with her lover beside her. The Black Knight standing beside the beast's landing spot hadn't joined the battle, instead assuming a guarding stance the moment the dark fog exited the portal. He was a head taller than the rest of the knights on the battlefield, his strength and imposing aura more powerful than the rest. It was plain to see that he was their leader. "It's the natives of this plane, my lady. They had an ambush set up outside the portal. I guess they wanted to destroy all of us at once. It's a pity that their abilities are so weak. Please wait a little longer, we'll eliminate these plebeians who don't know what's good for them at once." An ambush by the natives? That's really a surprise. The knight completely opened her seductive eyes, studying the surroundings before finally resting her gaze on the group of priests not far away. She narrowed her eyes slightly. "Level 15 priests? It looks like the ambush was well thought out. What determination. But, do they really think level means everything?" "Rest assured, my lady. I'll go and behead all of them right now," the leader solemnly promised. The knight let out a sweet smile. "How could I wait that long?" She jumped into the air the moment she was done speaking, twisting herself behind her cloak before disappearing completely. She appeared in the midst of the priests in the blink of an eye, as if the several hundred meters between them were non-existent. The knight poked her tiny head out from behind the cloak, charmingly and gently sticking to a priest's body. She wrapped her left hand around his shoulder, boldly reaching into the neckline of his robes to gently touch his chest. A dagger that was black as ink inexplicably appeared in her right hand, and she pierced his throat with hardly any effort. The extremely sharp edge of the blade immediately cut into half of the priest's neck before it was quietly withdrawn. Everything had happened so fast. The priest hadn't even realized anything, casting one last spell before feeling something wrong with his neck. That was the exact moment that fresh blood started spurting out, and as he struggled to keep from falling, 8 of his kin had experienced the same fate. Blood either spurted out of their necks, or there was an eye-catching red scar on their neckline. The high-ranking priest at the center sensed something amiss, sweeping his gaze all around as he raised both hands at the same time. A holy barrier that seemed to be liquid shot out of his hands, covering his entire body. Half a second later, the wall of valor would be complete. Only a warrior above level 15 would be able to break it once done, and even such a warrior would have to use their full power. However, a split second from completing the spell, the old priest's body suddenly trembled. The mana he had condensed withered, scattering away as his spell failed. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 50. Coincidence 3. The priest froze with an indescribable fear as he slowly looked down. Seeing the black dagger that had inexplicably appeared at his chest, he raised a stunned face to look at an enchanting visage. The knight truly was extremely beautiful, with an air of mystery surrounding her. Her misty eyes made it seem like she was forever stuck in a battle with a lover, and at that moment she was so close to him she was practically leaning. Their faces were merely 10 centimeters apart, and the priest could feel the warmth of her glowing face and enchanting breath. He struggled to lower his head once again. Outside of her deep cleavage and the rest of her body exposed by the scant outfit, the most shocking thing was that her hands were held tightly onto a double-edged dagger. Even with the dagger completely buried into his chest, the wound did not expand. Only a little blood seeped out, but while the dagger's tip had been in front of him before, now it was the hilt instead. He hadn't even felt the change happen, much less see it. The old priest did not speak a word, but he was not yet dead. The short blade had pierced his spine, not his heart, and lifeblood was still pumping vigorously from his beating chest. The knight suddenly let out a malicious smile, but her beauty added an element of animalistic charm to it. She suddenly placed her hand on his chest and pushed in with abrupt force, managing to pierce his ribcage and pull out a violently beating heart. The priest gaped up at the sky, his gaze slowly blurring. The knight stuck out her crimson tongue and crudely licked his face, after which she took his heart to her mouth. Squelch, a crushing sound rang out as she took a clear bite, starting to chew. However, she frowned after a few bites, spitting out flesh and blood as she cursed loudly, "It reeks." She waved her hand at the same time, sending the remains of the heart flying. It lit up with gentle flames as it arced through the air, and a gust of wind whistled past as her beast swallowed the heart whole. It then landed in the midst of the battlefield, narrowing its eyes as it opened its big mouth in delight. It was as though that small heart was the best thing it had ever tasted. The beast had crushed dozens of soldiers with its weight, and judging from the minimal twitching of their bodies, it seemed like they had met their end. It was only then that the old priest's body slipped down, falling to the ground with a thud. The knight fished out a clean, white handkerchief out of who knows where as she carefully wiped the blood off her left gauntlet. The fights were still raging on in her surroundings, but the battle was already over. The loss of the priests and clerics were a heavy blow to the enemy soldiers, the magic supporting them vanishing as they lost more than 30% efficiency instantly. Tens of black knights continued to step out of the portal, and with the front lines collapsed, the battle became a massacre. Some deserters could even be seen at the edge of the battlefield. The knight finally finished wiping her gauntlet clean, and followed up by dabbing away the blood and flesh left at the corners of her mouth. However, her lips were still stained crimson. It was as though they would drip with more blood at any time. She looked at the old priest's corpse with eyes still wide open, spitting out viciously with a look of disdain, "A level 15 priest, but he's still rancid. As expected, old meat really isn't for me. I should find something soft and tasty." By that time, the battle had already ended. The fierce knights had decimated the ambush with the help of the great mages, even taking out those who tried to flee. The deserters hadn't gotten very far before they were caught. The near 3-meter-tall leader walked to the female knight once again, bowing almost 90 degrees to reach her height. He spoke in an incredibly respectful tone, "All the enemies have been killed, my lady. We lost 9 of our own in battle, and our number now stands at 71. What instructions do you have?" The knight was in no hurry as she surveyed the battlefield. Over 600 corpses lay on the battlefield, with more than half of those surrounding the fallen knights and their mounts. The knights, and even their mounts, had launched a formidable counterattack when they neared death. The battlefield reeked of blood, with more still flowing out of the piles of corpses to seemingly dye the entirety of the land red. The knight took in a deep breath to soak in the stench in the air, closing her eyes with a look of incomparable euphoria on her face. After what seemed to be forever, she finally murmured, "Wherever you are, blood always smells so good. The knight captain let out a few maniacal laughs, so true. The female knight opened her eyes once more. For a plane limited to level 18, sending a level 15 priest is quite the effort. But all that's useless against me. Alright, gather everyone around, I want this battlefield cleaned in 10 minutes. After that, let's go take a look at what the people at the base were doing and why the portal opened up at such a god-forsaken place that we got ambushed. Having given the order, she walked to the large manticore while saying coldly, I hope there's a few tasty humans in the base. I'll only consider sparing those worthless creatures if I'm satisfied tonight. The leader of the knights let out a deep laugh. Then it looks like there will be more blood tonight, Lady Sinclair. Sinclair responded viciously, don't rain on my damned parade. The knight immediately went quiet, trembling slightly. Any noble from Norland would recognize this female knight. She was Sinclair Schumpeter, one of the elite daughters of the Schumpeter family. At the same time, they would also recognize the family's elite warriors, the Bear Guard Knights. From their mounts to the knights themselves, the Bear Guard were specially bred. Each individual was at least level 12, and they had 3 runes on them as a standard. Only being a few hundred years old, the Schumpeters only had about 150 of them, but the fact that Sinclair brought out more than half to this plane proved that they put a lot of stock into this battle. It also showed their sincerity and determination to remain in the top circles of Faust. Were Sinclair to meet with any mishap on this incursion, the family would not be far off from losing its island. Only in her early 20s, Sinclair was just level 15. However, most people focused on her leadership in battle. Her strange and ferocious style of command would be put on for all to see. If not for Alice Archeron's meteoric rise to the top, she might have been the brightest female general in the Sacred Alliance. In a secondary plane with the power limit capped at level 18, the Schumpeters had sent Sinclair, 2 great magicians at level 14, and 80 Bear Guard Knights alongside support from an existing base. This would be more than enough to serve as the seeds for controlling this plane. Why would there be any chance for failure? The biggest expense for the family had been transporting this entire team. However, any accidents could happen in the endless plains. Half an hour later, Sinclair was stood in front of the Schumpeter base with an ashen complexion. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 51. Trial. She had been informed that this base used to belong to the Menses, and had been operating for more than 10 years. There were over 500 soldiers stationed, controlling a 10-kilometer radius like a small town. This place was far larger than the small outpost the Archerons had given Richard, and the difference was obvious from first sight. These walls were more than 10 meters tall, unlike the minuscule ones Richard had mounted a defense behind. With another 10 stable years of operations, the family could have applied to the Church of the Eternal Dragon and have the plane earmarked and numbered. If the leader of the base remained strategic, resourceful, and unscrupulous, it wouldn't even take that long. A plane with an identity with the Church of the Eternal Dragon would have a stable passage, which meant greater volumes of resources and benefits could be drawn from it. This was another reason why the Schumpeters were so willing to invest their capital into this. However, the base in front of Sinclair was deathly quiet, the gates half open with not a single person in sight. The silence was deafening, and surrounded by forest, the base wasn't even connected to any other location. How could a base with more than 2,000 people, 500 of them being soldiers, survive in this barren forest? Even not considering agricultural supplies, they would have had to establish more than 10 hamlets nearby. Sinclair didn't think the Menses would make a mistake of this nature, as it was common sense. Her eyes narrowed, a strong sense of unease building up. With a wave of his hands, the leader of the Bear Guard Knights personally led 10 knights and a great mage into the base. Half an hour later, they walked out of the base with extremely unpleasant looks on their faces. The knight captain and the mage stood in front of Sinclair, but they were both at a loss for words. Sinclair spoke coldly, "Speak. What is it that you can't say? Is there a pile of dead people inside? Even so, what's the big deal? After all, they should all belong to the Mensa family. The captain finally spoke up, "My lady, there isn't a single person in the base. However, everything else is still present, including armor, supplies, and clothes. The only thing absent is the humans." The mage opened his mouth to speak, but what he said was even more depressing. "Unfortunately, none of the items are usable. The place is overflowing with the power of time, and it is impossible to purge. These are not livable conditions." "And what about the lighthouse of time?" she screamed in question. The captain and mage exchanged glances, and the former admitted, "It's been extinguished." "Extinguished?" Sinclair's voice resounded through the empty base. "Yes." The captain braced himself for the worst. For her part, Sinclair was dumbfounded. Everyone grew quiet in a split second, the only sound in the area being that of the wind. "Ha! Ha! Ha 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 ha!" Sinclair started with a giggle that grew into a full-blown laughter that startled the birds on the mountain. The manic guffawing continued on for a good 10 minutes before she finally calmed down. By then, her face had started to turn a peculiar shade of red, looking even more bewitching than before. "It took her some effort to catch her breath, so we've reached a completely foreign plane, and can't go back. And Norland won't be able to reach us unless we can find a way to rekindle the lighthouse of time. You guys need to make a decision now. Are you ready to tough it out with me?" The captain and two mages glanced at each other, before agreeing to stick by Sinclair and vowing to listen to her every instruction. Even if they'd been unwilling, they would have had no choice. There were only two ways to conquer a plane: occupy it all, becoming an enemy of every creature of the plane in the process, or infiltrate society and gain allies. Both were comparable in terms of danger and difficulty, but the second would cause one standing in their home plane to fall. Either way, the captain and mages only knew combat, not politics and strategy. Even if this plane was limited to level 18, leaving Norland's protection meant they wouldn't be able to hold on very long themselves. And given Sinclair's personality, if they didn't declare loyalty, she would likely have them killed anyway. Sinclair faked a smile and eyeballed the expressions on the three faces in front of her. She then said, "Smart move. Anyway, you lot have a bit of good luck. Don't you feel anything yet?" The two great mages tried to extend their senses and analyze the situation, but could only get a hint of what was going on. They couldn't pinpoint this good luck Sinclair was talking about. As for the captain, the powers of space and time were not his domain. He decided not to waste his efforts. Seeing all three of them baffled, Sinclair flashed a sinister smile before sticking out her bright red tongue and licking her lips. "The time flow of this plane is anywhere between an eighth and a tenth of Norland's. That means it has been blessed by the eternal dragon. When we take this plane and return home, we'll leave the old fogies with an unforgettable impression. I can't wait to find out how their hearts will taste." She patted the neck of the manticore, causing the humongous creature to stand upright as it abruptly let out an earth-shaking roar. "All of you, come with me. Let's find a place to rest tonight. Better still if there's young and beautiful men and women." The manticore leapt over the knights in the midst of her speech, being the first to race down the mountain. Back in a church in the White Rock Duchy, Eshin was kneeling inside a room as he spoke of the invasion of Baron Forza's lands. Although the place wasn't big, there was a tall platform to one side with three elderly priests behind it. From their dense divine powers to the glow of their skin, it was evident that they were higher in rank than Eshin himself. And from the looks of things, it looked like Eshin was on trial. And he was on trial indeed. The Church of Valor in Forza's territory had been torn to shreds, and the page from the Book of Holding, which was held in high regard by the god of valor, had sadly been destroyed. Furthermore, all of the clerics and paladins of the church had been killed. Any one of these charges was sufficient for Eshin to be served a cup of poisoned wine. However, Eshin's voice still resounded through the hall. Once he was done explaining the situation, he didn't try to defend or clear his name, instead sincerely asking for the church to send out a troop of battle priests along with an army of paladins supported by elites to eliminate the invaders. He even asked for the elite mountain troops of the White Rock Duchy. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 52. Trial 2. Why? The old priest in the middle questioned in a dignified manner. This group of invaders is unlike any that has come before. They're much younger, with great potential and the cunning to obtain what they wish for. Their style of battle is unusual and unpredictable, and most importantly they have a cleric amongst their ranks. The one on the left commented, "Does a group of insignificant invaders really require our battle priests and the more powerful paladins? Even intruders of a higher level would not need the church activating all its troops. This time is different. I have a premonition that this invasion could cause an interplanar war." Eshin remarked bitterly, a pained smile on his face. An interplanar war? The priest on the right sneered, less than 24 invaders could cause a war between planes? That term is interesting though, it's my first time hearing of it. Are you saying that these insignificant invaders are all individually as powerful as the astral beasts of the past? Eshin helplessly repeated himself with a sigh, "They have a cleric." The old priest sitting on the right sniggered even more piercingly, saying, "A cleric? How many spells did they cast? Don't tell me it was more than 10. This is Phalar, the god of Valor's plane. Which demonic god can secretly send their power here? Even children know this, Eshin. I once thought you were bright and responsible. I didn't expect you to fabricate nonsense in a bid to cover up your defeat." Eshin opened his mouth, but was momentarily at a loss for words. The priest was right, even he himself was unable to believe it until he saw that priestess perform more than 10 spells. Even if Baron Forza's soldiers brought back news that all pointed to this conclusion, he'd never once believed it himself, thinking all along that it was an excuse they'd given to shirk responsibility. Despite knowing the outcome, he heaved a sigh and repeatedly nodded his head, saying, "The cleric did in fact perform more than 10 spells." Such a reply could very well increase the degree of his punishment, and he knew it, but he really needed to warn the high priests. The moment he said this, the faces of the 3 priests immediately changed. It was not with surprise, however, but anger. After a period of silence, the one in the middle asked those to his sides, "How should this be dealt with, Adot?" The priest on the left hesitated to speak, but after a while he couldn't help but blurt out, "Penal servitude." The priest on the right sighed deeply, looking at Eshin with a piercing gaze, "Penal servitude." The one in the center nodded in agreement, looking at Eshin, "Priest Eshin. Your negligence has destroyed a church, lost a sacred relic, and had the church's paladins killed. The clergy hereby sentences you to 5 years of penal servitude in a barren land. Do you have any objections?" Eshin shook his head. In fact, the priests were already letting him off by punishing him in this manner. Even though people who were dealt with the same punishment as him rarely survived past 3 years, he himself could likely survive more than 10. This was much better than an immediate execution, as through this they were giving him a chance to live. Penal servitude was considered a punishment with pardon. The priest in the middle ended with a question, "Eshin, do you have any requests?" And in response, Eshin resolutely lifted his head, "My last request is for battle priests and at least 100 paladins to be deployed to destroy these invaders, and leave none of them standing." The priest looked conflicted, saying with a sigh, "There is something that you're still not aware of, my child. Another batch of powerful invaders has recently entered our plane. The church's battle priests and half of the elite paladins were transferred out to deal with them, but the results of the battle are out. The combined forces of 2 big churches were all wiped out." What? Eshin stood up abruptly in shock. Nothing can be done about the invasion of Baron Forza's lands at the moment. We can only rely on Earl Jalian's troops handling the situation. We need to use all our might to rid us of these new invaders. We have already cautioned the cardinals of the Central Church, and will soon gather an army to suppress these enemy troops. Eshin sighed and said helplessly, I still stand by my request. Even the strongest invaders can be defeated if they have no priests in their midst, but these ones are different. They will establish themselves here and grow, eventually destroying all of Thaler. Enough! Eshin, I've had enough of your wild imagination. The priest on the right rebuked angrily, if only you didn't live in your fantasies all the time, and spent that time studying the Lord's teachings. Your achievements would greatly surpass what they are today. Perhaps, Eshin sighed, but he stopped retorting and let two paladins drag him out of the hall. Early that morning, Richard set off from the base alongside his troops. It would be a long journey, and nobody could estimate the time of their return. The trolls in Gangdar each had big chests in hand, while the rest carried their own equipment and supplies to head towards the depths of the forest. Without the right equipment to transport their belongings, there were still many goods and supplies that they had no choice but to leave at base. It had only taken a few minutes for Richard to decide whether to leave them or destroy them. He'd followed his intuition, after all, it was no big deal to leave this equipment here. With Baron Forza's strength, the most he could do was hold on to these items for now. When he returned, he would recover it all with interest. The path leading to the northwest wasn't a proper road. There were small tracks that snaked deep into the mountains and untouched forest, with most of the area deserted. The only people who passed by this area were adventurers. Despite all that, Richard steered clear of the beaten path to avoid being tracked. He signaled the broodmother to pave a new path for them a few kilometers away, parallel to the existing one. Safety wouldn't be a problem, any dangers the broodmother passed through would be completely swept away. And thus, the troops progressed smoothly along this new path. The forest was deathly quiet, with no beasts in sight. There were still a few ruins of goblin camps and the like along the way, but none of them had any life. They walked for an entire day in the lifeless and unchanging surroundings. Everyone except Richard slowly started to tire, and even the trolls who were in such high spirits that they were cracking jokes at the beginning started to quiet down. Having been in this desolate forest for a significant amount of time, everyone was starting to feel a measure of gloom in their souls. Only Richard knew the reason for this. The path had been paved by the broodmother, so any dangerous beasts along the way had become food. Those that were lucky enough to escape death steered clear of this place once they smelt its presence. Richard suddenly stopped in his tracks, closing his eyes as he seemingly tried to make sense of something. There was a clear fluctuation in his sea of consciousness, as the number of raptors near the broodmother started to drop. 3 of the lit spots in his mind's vision had disappeared in the blink of an eye. Broodmother, what's wrong? Richard asked in alarm. There is a really unusual, strong enemy here, Master. I might need your help, the broodmother replied. This startled Richard. This was the first time the broodmother had asked him for help. He immediately identified its location, relieved to find that they were less than 10 kilometers apart. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 53. Necromancer. What's wrong, boss? Gangdar asked. Richard blinked open his eyes, replying, Get ready, we're going into battle. And it could be a bitter one this time. Gangdar was stunned for a moment, but then he burst out into a wide grin. That's great, Dut. Waterflower gently pursed her lips together, but her eyes lit up as well. Most of the rest were equally pumped up upon hearing the news. They'd been walking through this dreary forest for too long, and it would be good to have some action to revive their drooping spirits. Once he'd figured out the broodmother's whereabouts, Richard rushed towards the battleground. The ground terrain shifted to a downward slope in a few kilometers, before a swamp shrouded in gray fog came into view. The broodmother's huge body was hard to spot in the thick fog, occasionally flitting out of sight. Everyone who saw it was taken aback for a moment, and even the troll brothers stopped abruptly in their tracks at the sight of the 2-meter-tall and 6-meter-long creature. Medium Rare scratched his head in astonishment, unable to believe his eyes. The broodmother was in the midst of battle, screeching continuously as it slowly moved its bulky body, spraying acid in all directions. Its large, sunken belly expanded and contracted regularly, sending greenish-yellow liquid spurting out from all its folds. The rancid odor could be smelt from miles away, and even the trolls who were resistant to corrosive damage wouldn't dare rush into this mist that was as strong as a grade 6 spell. Richard squinted. Even though the fog and acid spray made for poor visibility, he could see that the broodmother was fighting over 100 undead creatures. And to add to that, an uncountable number of undead were crawling out of the fog without end. Around it were many wounded raptors fighting a significant number of the undead for their very lives. Even though these creatures were only low-level skeletons and zombies, no matter how hard the raptors bit or how fast they threw themselves at these opponents, it was impossible to have them back down. Breaking an arm or leg would hardly affect these creatures, the only way to victory being destroying them to bits. Worse still, the acid fog from the broodmother had limited effect on undead. Although it caused the bones to decay and break, it took some time for these creatures to stop moving from just that. It was actually easier for the raptors to rip them to shreds with their bladed limbs. The battle was taking place on the edge of the swamp, and there was mud everywhere. These conditions made it difficult for the raptors to exercise their superior agility, and the zombies and skeletons poured forth relentlessly. The raptors were almost all out of energy, and it seemed like they were about to be overpowered. Waves of about 10 skeletons and zombies surged forth without end, completely cornering them and pressuring them deeper into the sludge. There were many skeletons and zombies crawling all over the broodmother's body, with hundreds more nearby. However, the limited offensive power of these creatures left their damage to it insignificant, unable to breach the outer shell. Where had all these undead come from? Broodmother, stop the acid fog. Richard realized that the acid wasn't doing much to the opponents, instead only causing his own army to be afraid of approaching. At that very moment, however, strong mana emanated from the swamp and attacked the broodmother. Its actions immediately grew sluggish, and it let out a shrill cry. Being one with the broodmother in soul, Richard felt his consciousness being penetrated by a needle, as if a ray of light had swept across his brain and blanked it out. This was only momentary, however, as the remaining contracts lit up and divided the damage. He regained consciousness just as suddenly as he had lost it, with a throbbing pain to remind him that it wasn't just a fantasy. This was a soul spell, Mind Flay. Even as the broodmother's consciousness blanked out, another wave of mana emanated from the swamp. This time, it caused the broodmother to lose control of its body, and even if it only took a split second to recover that control, Richard could feel the substantial effects of that second wave. Mind control. Many skilled mages believed this spell to be the first step to controlling a magical creature, cast just before enslave. Richard and the broodmother were connected via soul, and there was a soul contract between him and Waterflower as well. There were 4 other members of the party contracted to him on top of that. If this opponent wanted to exert control over the broodmother, they would have to do the same to everyone else he was linked to. How could that be possible? Richard, Gangder, the 2 trolls, and Ola all had steadfast determination. However, the most unexpected member of this battle was Waterflower. The young lady's thoughts had always been pure and simple, her soul as clear as a glass of water. Once she grew aware of the attempted control, she erupted with power. The short self-cut hair on her head stood up, as she opened her mouth with a sharp hiss. She let loose a burst of unadulterated killer instinct, countering the source of the attack. Despite his initial surprise, Richard didn't hesitate to channel his own mental power over, stoking that desire to kill even more. An indistinct roar sounded from the center of the swamp, and all the undead stilled for a moment before moving again. Now, however, it was evident that they were sluggish, disorderly, and chaotic, unlike the originally ordered swarm. Richard gritted his teeth with a cold glint in his eyes. There should be a necromancer somewhere here. To think he has the guts to try and control my broodmother, what guts? This fellow really has an appetite. He stretched out his right hand, shouting loudly, "Sword!" An armed knight passed Richard his unnamed sword, and Flozan silently walked over before reaching out to touch it. The tip of the sword instantly lit up with sacred fire. Waterflower's eyes lit up, and she quietly placed the shepherd of eternal rest before Flozan. The cleric lifted her gaze to eye the girl, before reaching her hand out to the cloth sheath of the sword. "This is great!" Gangder exclaimed loudly, daringly extending his axe over as well. Every weapon was burning with sacred flames not long after, and according to Flozan it would last 9 minutes corresponding to her level. The broodmother followed Richard's orders to climb out of the swamp, slowly approaching the army. The curtain of acid fog was left behind, while the 10 surviving raptors managed to extricate themselves from the weak undead and began drawing closer to Richard. As for the rest, Richard could see their corpses sink into the mud. He took large strides to the edge of the swamp, lightly waving his sword to slice 2 skeletons in half. He then followed up with a slash to a zombie's stomach. "Whoever is inside, listen up. I'm giving you one chance, surrender immediately." Boosted by mana, his voice echoed throughout the swamp. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 54. Necromancer, 2. The only answer Richard's question got was a deluge of skeletons and zombies. He raised his burning sword in response, slowly pointing it forward. All sorts of howls and roars erupted from behind him, as the ferocious monsters that were his party led the army forward, pouncing towards the group of undead. The fastest of the lot was Waterflower, bounding across the sludge like it was level ground as she flitted past Richard into the midst of the undead. Flowers bloomed in her path, looking quite like lotuses as the enemies were set aflame like torches of holy fire. The sheer effectiveness of Flozan's flames far surpassed anyone's imagination, as even 1,000 enemies melted away like butter without the ability to withstand a single blow. The opponents were cleared up quickly, and the party came up to the center of the swamp. As if on cue, the holy flames at the tip of Richard's blade disappeared. A lone island appeared in Richard's sight, with an attention-grabbing 2-story building upon it. The place looked crude and dilapidated, apparently having already been around for quite a while. A lanky man was stood by the door, looking at least 30 years old. The unkempt hair, dark circles, and pale skin would leave a deep impression on anyone, and his robes were so filthy that it was impossible to tell what they once looked like. His lips were dried out, looking an ashen green. If not for the slight rise and fall of his chest, he would seem no different from a zombie himself. Richard stepped foot on the little island, his sword screeching against the ground. He narrowed his eyes at the man in front of the building, speaking dully, "You dare to try and control my contract beast? The guts! Is this considered robbing me?" The man furrowed his brows, his eyes stuck on Flozan. A hoarse and unpleasant voice sounded out, "What a terrifying cleric, .. It was only then that he scanned the rest of the party, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Waterflower. That mental counterattack had evidently etched a strong impression, or rather great pain, onto his mind. At the end of it all, his gaze landed on Richard once more. "You're a mage?" He couldn't help but frown, asking that question with uncertainty. He'd felt great sword skills from Richard during the battle, but now he was feeling powerful mana from the boy. Level 9, Richard answered calmly. Richard had tossed over a detection spell while the man was judging the rest, and strangely enough he seemed not to have noticed it as he didn't shield himself with his mana. The results had left him slightly surprised. This was a level 12 necromancer with 6 rune slots and up to 90 points of capacity. The necromancer gave Richard a close look. "Well then, esteemed sir, I would like to duel you based on magic tradition. Although I am of a higher rank, I've already lost all of my servants and have less than a quarter of my mana remaining. My request is not unfair." "Magic tradition?" Richard asked, an underlying meaning to his words. "Do other mages consider you one of their kind?" "Outside of the abyss, hell, and planes that lean towards evil, even places under control of dark gods, had no favor for necromancers who played with souls and disturbed the peace of the dead. The man's expression changed, immediately growing malicious and twisted as he howled, "That's true. Since everyone believes us to be evil and bloodthirsty, then so be it. I hid myself here because I don't wish to kill with abandon, but you still come knocking at my door. Since you aren't willing to acknowledge my right as a mage, then come at me together. I'll tear you all apart." Richard took a close look at the necromancer, the dancing numbers in his vision gradually growing clear. It was true that the necromancer didn't have much mana left, and basically all of his permanent familiars had been killed. A necromancer without undead was like a knight without a mount. He quickly decided on his next tactics. "Although you aren't acknowledged by the rest of the mages, I am still willing to duel you based on tradition." "My lord. There's no need for that, is there? Can't we all just swarm and defeat him like when you dealt with Menta?" Ola asked from the side. He was the last person whose weapon was enchanted by Flozin, and the holy flames on his arrows would be a huge threat to the necromancer. Richard waved his hand to stop the bard. "No, this one is different. He's a mage." "A mage?" While the necromancer was a mage indeed, Ola could not understand why they needed to treat mages and melee fighters differently. On the other hand, the necromancer's stiff face changed. He adjusted his robes, taking 2 steps forward to state solemnly, "I am Zendral, a level 12 necromancer." Richard buried his sword into the mud without much thought, taking a step forward himself. "Richard. Level 9 mage, and runemaster." The word runemaster sent a sliver of doubt flashing across Zendral's face. He'd evidently never heard of such a profession. However, they quickly moved on to the duel, facing each other with 20 meters of distance between them. Although it was impossible to tell what spell Zendral began casting because of the different language, a dark gray magic formation immediately appeared in front of the necromancer. A dense power of death pervaded the air, and power surged into the throbbing formation, as if some live creature wanted to break out. Richard's senses told him that this would be a summon undead spell, and with Zendral's level a powerful undead creature would soon appear on the plane. The formation pulsed with negative energy, sending out terror and darkness into the minds of those nearby. The creature already had such great spiritual power before even appearing, making it obvious that this was a powerful formation. The only downside was the duration of the cast. Richard had no intent of casting a spell himself, instead retrieving the remnant page of the Book of Holding as he silently activated it with a shake of his hands. 5 direwolves immediately appeared on the battlefield, howling as they pounced onto the necromancer together. Dozens of blue and green lights did their utmost to protect the necromancer's body, but a crackling sound rang out very quickly. His defensive spell had been damaged, and although 2 of the wolves were sent flying, he was pushed back as well. The summoning spell he was halfway through was naturally interrupted. Richard patiently waited until Zendral could hold on no longer, raising his hand and dispelling the spell to break the direwolves down into pure mana. The shield spell had been completely decimated under their attack, and the necromancer's already shabby clothes were almost turned into mere strips of cloth. There were bruises and injuries all over his body, but his fatal points were still protected even though on the verge of breaking down. None of the injuries he'd sustained would kill him. Zendral struggled to sit up as Richard drew closer. He tidied up his tattered robes. "To be able to die in a fair duel is my honor." "Do it!" Richard gazed at Zendral. "Are you that eager to die?" "Of course not. I still have far too many hypotheses to test. But I am an evil necromancer, not tolerated by any humans. If someone finds out, I will be burnt at the stake." Zendral laughed bitterly. "Indeed. Even in Norland, necromancers were few in number, considered the enemy of all living souls. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2, Chapter 55. The Blood-Stained Lands. Although I gave you the duel you wished for, you are still a necromancer. Zendral's expression dimmed at Richard's initial words, but what followed reignited his hope. However, I can consider giving you a chance. After all, a level 12 great mage is worthy of respect. But know this, before I make my final decision, you are my captive. I hope that as a necromancer you remain as noble as any other mage. I'm taking a huge risk here if you try to escape or attack. Zendral didn't care about the pain all over his body, straightening up as he spoke proudly. In terms of magic, I am no worse than a great mage. Furthermore, my pride and dignity are even greater than those of mages who have been corrupted by mortal pleasures. I swear in the name of the Lich King, I shall do nothing unbefitting of my status in my captivity. However, I would like to ask why you wish to capture me. If you plan to offer me to any kingdom, then please execute me now. I am not willing to be nailed to a stake and burned for display. Richard rummaged through some information from his memory, speaking calmly. I suppose I will be heavily rewarded or blessed if I offered a level 12 necromancer to a king or a god. Zendral remained silent for a moment, but then spoke up. Indeed. At the very least, you can become a titled knight if you offer me to a king or a grand duke. The amount of divine grace you will earn for sacrificing me to a god will be great as well, enough to advance a priest to level 10. Richard nodded, but before he could say anything Flozen chimed in from behind him. Necromancers would also make a great sacrifice to the eternal dragon. Although there isn't any church here, we can perform the sacrifice through the Book of Time. Richard's gaze at Zendral immediately changed with Flosan's words. The expression on the necromancer's face clearly wasn't great either. The cleric's holy flames had caused such great damage to his undead that he feared her despite her lower level. Looking over him a few times, Richard shook his head and sighed. Although I'm reluctant to give up on such a blessing, there is no need to worry. I won't be offering you to a god or king, for now at least. Our destination in this trip is the Bloodstained Lands, with only robbers, slavers, and barbarians. There is no king there, nor even a grand duke. However, even though the vow to the Lich King proves your sincerity, it is not enough. It is evident that our beliefs are completely different. You need to persuade me to believe in you. Please wait a minute, Zendral said with a nod. He went back into the small, run-down building, coming out shortly after with an exquisite box that he handed over to Richard. This is a magic box made out of a devil's skull that I prepared for myself. If I can advance to level 16, I am prepared to turn myself into a lich when my life nears its end. This is my future phylactery, a priceless tool for a necromancer. Richard nodded, stowing the item away. Welcome, Zendral. We now have another member on our team for the journey to the Bloodstained Lands. While Zendral spent time packing his items, Richard stood in front of the brood mother and fed it some magic crystals that it had asked for. One would truly feel the creature's formidable size when standing close. When the black shell filled one's entire vision, they would feel a sense of oppression that made it seem like they were facing a black hole. Even with his connection to it, Richard felt the awe of its form was a little too strong. He threw the crystals out one by one, and the brood mother devoured them instantly. It stopped after 20 pieces, laying down quietly for a few minutes. Then, there was a sudden crackling sound from within its shell as its conscience flared up once more. Master, I now have enough energy to advance to level 2. You need to choose another ability for me to strengthen, either for myself, or for the attack drones. There are 3 options if you wish to strengthen me: speed, defense, or the pace of creation of drones. As for the drones themselves, you can strengthen the raptors further or choose to add one of 2 new forms. Richard's mind was immediately flooded with information on the 2 new attack drones. One was a blood-sucking creature that resembled a bat, a fast-moving flighted beast with great perception that could be used to scout ahead. Although these things weren't strong in combat alone, a swarm of them would grow to be terrifying, especially since they could develop toxicity in the future. A single egg from the brood mother could hatch 1 raptor, but if he wanted these, then it could hatch 6. As for the second type of attack drones, they were wind wolves. These creatures looked exactly the same as ordinary wolves, except their claws were extraordinarily large. They were also quite fast, able to move quickly through complicated terrain. For offense, their characteristic ability to shoot wind blades made them special, the effects being the same as the magic spell. The recovery cycle was about the same as a human mage, and they could cast the spell thrice in a day. Overall, they were comparable to level 7 soldiers in terms of comprehensive combat ability. With a sufficient number of wind wolves guarding it, the broodmother would not have been so badly harassed at the battle by the swamp. The range of the sharp wind blades would have been of great help in a group battle. After repeated consideration, Richard decided to start off by increasing the broodmother's agility. Although it was strong in combat, its slow movement had now become its Achilles heel. He then set aside 20 more crystals for it to eat, allowing it to gain the ability to birth wind wolves. The basic consideration behind everything had been survival. Wind wolves looked no different from normal demonic wolves, and be it humans, orcs, or barbarians, everyone had a tradition of domesticating them. It wouldn't be odd for this team to have 10 wolves alongside them. Once Richard's team set off on their journey once more, the broodmother had finished its transformation. Its carapace had grown openable at the chest, revealing translucent organs that had reduced in weight by a third. The tiny limbs molted off, replaced by new, thicker, and stronger ones. Once the mutation was complete, the broodmother could move at 10 kilometers per hour. Even if this was still slow, it was twice of what it could manage before. The broodmother's mind grew stronger and clearer with this upgrade, and it contacted Richard once more. "Master, if you find statues or altars of ancestral worship, please bring them to me. I'm in dire need of divine power. If I get enough, I can both accelerate my progress and possibly form my second mind." Second mind? Richard asked. A new consciousness, able to think independently and assist in commanding the attack drones. It will greatly elevate my combat capabilities. Ancestral worship. Richard noted the request down, immediately thinking back to the statue of Nyan back in Forza's lands. However, the broodmother answered that it could not absorb the divine power of a true god yet, and that such a feat would only be possible after it reached level 7. The team passed through mountains and forests, but 3 more wind wolves surrounded them every day. As they reached the borders, Richard decided to have his team speed on as he left the raptors with the broodmother for protection and hunting. The broodmother would slowly move through the area that was abundant with food and without any enemy, replenishing its energy as Richard found a base to set up in. 10 days later, they finally made their way out into a vast, desolate world. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 56. The Bloodstained Lands, 2. This was a world of red, yellow, and brown. Small rock formations were everywhere, making for a forest of weathered stones. Endless canyons and caves made for complex terrain with numerous hiding spots, an unknown number of dangers hiding in the shadows. This land was barren, with almost nothing to be seen but rock and sand. There were a few shrubs to be sighted on occasion at the foot of a rock, but there was no river in this vast land that flowed through the year. Numerous small streams did flow during the rains, but they dried up as summer arrived. A handful of oases decorated the land like pearls, becoming centers of power. There were a few parts of the bloodstained lands that were rich in resources, but they were all close to the barbarian ancestral spirit plains in the west. Countless battles there had turned the once fertile land barren, painting it with blood. Richard took a deep breath as a gust of wind blew their way, immediately feeling a dry heat rushing up his nose alongside a few grains of coarse sand. 2 scorching suns hung up in the sky, their boiling light pouring fire onto the dry land. If one looked into the distance, the red pillars of stone would look like burning torches. Just the day before, they were struggling with the dark and damp of the forest. And now that they'd left the mountains, they'd entered a completely different world. Countless villains, gangs, and robbers lived on this land, the hands of the slavers stained with the blood of various races. A majority of the bloodstained lands were barren, but the place was also full of opportunities. Most of the specialty products from the barbarian plains could be sold for astronomical prices in civilized society, with compelling alchemic treasures and magic goods to be found. It was rumored that there were several mysterious death zones deep into the bloodstained lands, places where the fabric of spacetime was distorted. Exotic foreign creatures roamed the land, but there were also ruins with valuable treasures buried within. Even though the distorted spacetime was a powerful opponent, countless adventurers remained attracted by the prospects of those treasures. It was high noon, and within half an hour of entering the desert, Richard was sweating hard. The others looked tired as well, so they had to look for a shady spot under a cliff to rest as they waited for the heat to subside. Horses became extremely important in the blood-stained lands. All of the horses they'd seized from Baron Forza had been sent alongside the vanguard, successfully crossing through the Sequoia Kingdom to reach the blood-stained lands. The vanguard had 2 raptors with them, and through those Richard could keep tabs on the vanguard's location. Once they were under the shadow of the peak, the group immediately collapsed to get a drink of water and some rest. Richard went out of the shade, squinting his eyes at the 2 suns that seemed motionless in the sky. He shook his head helplessly, turning around to shout, "Let's rest. It seems like we'll have to wait until the evening to set off." Thus, the men all struggled to get up and tidy some flat ground to rest upon. Medium Rare then set up some simple crockery, beginning to cook food for them all. Richard wiped the sweat from his forehead, returning to the shade and opening a map to study. This map was very simple and lacking, not even outlining the entirety of the blood-stained lands. It was hand-drawn by rogues, so even if it did indicate the locations of several well-known oases and camps, it could not be considered precise. If they used it as the basis of their movements, they would end up deviating a great distance from their destination. However, this simple map was a prize obtained from wiping out the Church of Valor. In this plane, maps were priceless. The bloodstained lands were filled with unpredictable dangers. Outside of the oases and a few permanent neutral camps, a large part of the area was completely blank. There were only a few simple terms on the map, some pointing out well-known places and some even just naming locals. The true maps were in the hands of the slavers, who'd been navigating the place for years. Richard had already marked a path on the corner of the map, filling out details of the terrain around the parts they'd already crossed. Precision allowed him to draw complicated magical formations with ease, so cartography wasn't too much of a problem. Ola ran over to Richard's side, asking, "What are we going to do next, my lord?" Richard pointed to a camp symbol on the map. "We'll start by meeting up with the vanguard. Once we have horses, we can try our luck at Camp Bloodstone. We need to find a guide familiar with this area and look at what we can do." Ola was puzzled. "Try our luck?" Richard smiled. "We'll be settling down here. Aliens, scum, and the rubbish from everywhere are left here, and they'll make for natural allies. Here, nobody will care where we come from as long as we have the capabilities." "Including barbarians?" the elven bard asked cautiously, although his expression was somewhat unnatural. Richard cast an odd glance at him. "Of course." The unpleasant expression was followed up with a pale face. Richard wondered what the fellow had experienced that had left such great trauma against barbarians. Having sent Ola away, Richard walked over to Tiramisu and patted him on the back. "I need you to transcribe a few more magic scrolls. I heard that stuff is exorbitant in this plane, so we could potentially make a fortune. It will also help grow your mana pool. Speaking of, when do you expect to level up?" Tiramisu scratched his head. "I'll be level 10 in about a month." Trolls were different from humans, weaker in magic at the same level. A level 10 troll mage was about the same as a level 8 human. Richard nodded. "Not bad. I'm really anticipating the day you get to level 12, but..." Trolls were likely to experience a mutation at level 12, growing another head or evolving some rare bloodline ability. Even the most common additional head would be great, since the mage would be able to cast spells much faster that way. After circling around and talking to everyone, Richard found a place to sit down. He took out a piece of hide, continuing to draft an unfinished rune. Some training had left him fully able to draw runes in any environment, be it the special dwarven alchemy tables back in the deep blue or the small desk back on the Archaran island. Even the flat stone before him now was no matter, not affecting the precision of his formations at all. This specific rune was elementary strength, being drafted for Gangder. Richard would be able to make for a 30% boost given his current materials, making Gangder's strength equivalent to Menta's. That would also greatly increase his combat capabilities. Flozin was sat beside Richard, watching as he drafted the rune. "It's not easy to lead, is it?" she asked. The pen didn't stop, the line remaining flat and neat. "Yes. I need to consider everyone and everything, and understand all your thoughts. I still need everyone in the future. I need to gain their trust instead of relying on the contract that binds them. Besides, even if I want to, I don't have any slave contracts left." He continued to complete a curve, stowing his pen away as he said thoughtfully, "But trust seems hard to gain." Flozin smiled slightly. "You have already gained mine." He flashed his own in response, "But there's still the others." Flozin brushed through his long hair. "That is easy. You just need to lead them to victory in a few more battles." Richard nodded. "That's true. But you seem to have forgotten someone," she reminded him. "Who?" "Waterflower." "Waterflower?" Richard found it strange at first, but immediately understood. Their souls were connected, allowing him to know the girl's location and summon her when he wanted, but this did not mean that he knew what she was thinking, whether she was happy or dejected. He'd neglected her for a long time. "I understand now, thank you." Flozin smiled slightly. "You don't have to thank me. I still look forward to the day you bring us back to Norland." He replied profoundly, "I'm looking forward to the day before." Flozin was stunned for a moment, but then she pulled a long face before leaving with a snort. That look of surprise gave Richard a little sense of accomplishment. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 57. A Chaotic Order. A bright, round moon rose up when night fell, illuminating all of the blood-stained lands. The stars decorating the sky seemed to be set apart from the unrest on the ground, leaving many pillars of rock that had been eroded faintly glimmering under the silver light. Under the bright moonlight, Richard led his party to rendezvous with the team that had set out earlier. However, when he got to the meeting point, all he saw was a group of injured soldiers. The horses were gone, and there were only 12 soldiers remaining. Flozin immediately set to task healing the wounded soldiers, while Richard made rounds around the wounded soldiers to look at their injuries. Afterwards, he approached the leader of the knights to ask, who was responsible for this. They said they were Red Cossacks' men. They took an interest in our horses and offered a single gold coin per horse, 1/100th of the market value. They attacked us the moment I rejected them, with more than 200 men and 10 knights. Their strength far surpassed our team's, and few of us escaped. There was a cut so deep on the knight's back that his bone was almost showing. When he just met up with Richard, his wound was still discharging copious amounts of pus. Outside of that, he had more than 10 other slashes of various sizes all over his body, showing the intensity of the battle. Red Cossack, Richard repeated the name repeatedly, his face growing more pensive each time. He then asked, "Would you be able to recognize these attackers if you saw them again?" "That goes without saying." Their leader was a knight who was at least level 13, wearing red armor and carrying a two-handed sawtooth blade. "He's easy to recognize." Richard paced up and down, only stopping once Flozin was done healing the troops. He patted the knight on his shoulder, letting out a sigh. "You did well to survive. We can still snatch those horses back later, but if you perished in battle, where would I find such trustworthy people like you?" It had become increasingly apparent to Richard that the knights Gatton had granted him were immensely valuable. An expression of gratitude crossed the knight's face, and he struggled to perform a meticulous salute. "Serving Lord Gatton and the Arcarans has always been our purpose in life." The knight had never viewed Richard as his master. He served Gatton and the Ark herons. This was something Richard had sensed long ago, but he did not say anything, especially since every other knight who heard this sentence felt the same way. Such was the cohesiveness of the family, the legendary might of its leader. Their loyalty to Richard was an extension of their servitude to Gatton, and in the future they would do the same for Richard's son. Whoever led them, these knights served the Ark herons as a family. Even Gatton's mention was because of his sheer contribution to the family, so much so that he compared to the most talented of predecessors. In another 10 years, the man's achievements could surpass those of the ancestors. Many of these knights had served the Ark herons for generations. In return, the family had schooled and trained their young, giving them status, wealth, and the chance to advance. Those who excelled were given better protection for their families, relatives, and even their squads. They were like vines on fir trees in winter, depending on each other for support. This was the way of life for most noble families in Norland. In the cool, refreshing winds of the early morning, Richard brought his troops over towards Camp Bloodstone. The sun's first light started to slowly warm the desert, and eventually they were walking on boiling sand and burning stones. Beads of sweat started pouring out of Richard's forehead, but he had slowly gotten used to the dry heat as he steadily walked forward step by step. However, the name that had lost him half his soldiers and all his horses constantly popped up in his thoughts. Red Cossack. There were roads through the bloodstained lands as well, beaten paths made by the many passing travelers. These roads ended at neutral camps, areas with greenery and a water source. There were other roads formed by the passage of trade caravans, but as greenery dried up and camps changed, such roads grew smaller and eventually disappeared. Walking through the hot weather for half an hour, Richard came across a small road. It wasn't paved or marked, just a surface that had been leveled by the passage of horses and vehicles. According to the marks on his map, following this for a few kilometers would allow them to reach the main road leading to Camp Bloodstone. In part due to luck, Richard managed to make sense of the crude markings on the map. Sound judgments allowed him to take the correct path at every intersection, putting the party on the right track without much deviation. However, the path in front of him looked blocked. A few sharp tree trunks had been joined together to make an artificial blockade between two large rocks, sealing almost all of the path except a few meters. A few vicious-looking men could be seen aimlessly wandering around behind, with a flag tied to the highest point of the structure. The flag was drooping down vertically with the lack of wind, containing the picture of a bloody scythe. The bloodstained lands were quite traversable, and it would not be impossible to deviate from the main road. The only drawbacks were an increased chance of danger and a higher chance of getting lost. Even though the path ahead was blocked, a short detour around the path would bring them back to their desired path. However, whoever had built this structure had made it obvious that such a thing would not be easy. These blockades were designed to deter anyone from entering or leaving Camp Bloodstone. Hiding would be useless. Richard frowned slightly, walking towards the roadblock. Seeing the party from afar, a man behind the roadblock suddenly jumped up and blew hard on a whistle. 10 fierce, burly men stood up one after the other, grabbing their weapons as they rushed out from the sides of the rocks. One hefty man walked aggressively to the front, wielding his axe with great force as he shouted loudly, "Hey! You people over there, come here now! This place belongs to Blood Scythe Mark. Whoever is heading to Camp Bloodstone has to pay a toll." But roughly 100 meters away from the roadblock, Richard stopped walking. "We are not going to Camp Bloodstone." The man was startled. With the direction that Richard was heading, it was inconceivable for him to not be heading towards Camp Bloodstone. If he was just passing through the bloodstained lands, he would not have turned this way. He gave it some serious thought. If this fellow wasn't going to Camp Bloodstone, there was nowhere else for him to go. At this point, a man who was at least half a head taller than the rest walked out as well. He slapped his counterpart, who was still deep in thought, on the head and angrily rebuked him, "Idiot." He then pointed to Richard and howled out, "I don't care whether you're going to Camp Bloodstone. Now that we've seen you, you need to pay the toll. That's an order from Chief Mark. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. Please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 58. A lucrative project. Richard led his troops towards the roadblock without a change in his expression. We're going to Camp Bloodstone to try our luck. How much is the toll per person? We didn't pay a toll when we traveled this route in the past. Do the people in Camp Bloodstone know about this blockade? The burly man sat down, gently stroking his battle axe as he spoke menacingly. 1 silver per person, 2 for the bigger ones. 1 look at your party and I know that you're all a bunch of poor men. You don't even have a horse, but you want to try your luck at Bloodstone? Be good and hand over the toll. If you don't have money, you can pay us with whatever you own. Once you pay your toll, you'll receive a card. Nobody in Bloodstone will bully you if you have it. Blood Scythemark is the big boss of Bloodstone Camp. Richard frowned. Isn't Stormhammer the boss of Camp Bloodstone? Was there a change of leadership? The man's complexion suddenly changed, and he spoke angrily. Of course Stormhammer is still the boss, but Bloodscythe has a lot of say in the camp. Stop giving me your bullshit, and hand over the toll now. Medium Rare grew angry, baring his tusks and stamping the ground with force. He wanted to charge ahead, the earth shaking for a moment with the impact of his stomp. Looking at the might of the large troll, the burly man's expression immediately changed. He grasped his axe tightly to guard himself and shouted, "What are you lot up to?" His companions behind him also grabbed their weapons and readied fighting stances. Even though the burly man was not afraid of a full-grown troll, he did not dare underestimate Medium Rare either. This troll looked different from the rest. By that time, Richard had been made fully aware of the situation behind the roadblock. There was a camp that could accommodate 20 to 30 people there, with 28 men waiting in tow, including the ones they were talking to right now. They all had different kinds of weapons and armor, some leather and some iron. There were even some people with plate mail boots but a full suit of leather armor instead. Most of these people looked tan and rosy, and it was difficult to say whether they were sunburned or a lot of dirt and grime had accumulated on their skin. The conditions surrounding the bloodstained lands made baths a luxury not all could afford. Once all his observations were made, Richard was sure of the capabilities of these soldiers. The burly leader was around level 10, making him about the same as a novice knight. The rest were mostly between levels 5 and 8, but judging from their fierce expressions it was obvious that they were used to seeing blood. The bloodstained lands really lived up to their name. A mere roadblock had a group of soldiers equivalent to veterans and captains outside. Richard reached for a gold coin, tossing it to the burly leader. "We're not up to any mischief, we'll pay the toll." 1 gold coin should cover our group, no? The gold coin danced in the air, forming a high trail as it reflected blinding sunlight that made it difficult for everyone to open their eyes. 1 gold coin in the mainland was equal to 120 silver. There were less than 30 people in Richard's party, so even with the addition of the 10 wind wolves the tax for passage would still be less than a single gold. With a soft pop, the gold coin disappeared in the burly man's hand. He unfolded his hand to closely inspect the beautiful gold coin, suddenly inhaling a breath of warm air as he cried out lowly, "It's a church coin." Even though the weights of the coins on the mainland were standardized in weight, there were different bodies that issued them. The 3 most common ones were the churches, the kingdoms, and other nobles. Church coins were the highest quality of the lot, with great craftsmanship that was not easy to replicate. This made them more valuable than the rest, being worth 150 silver. The gold coin Richard tossed out came from the Church of Valor, but how he acquired it was a story for another day. Looking at the gold coin, the burly man's eyes turned red with greed and the soldiers behind him grew even more excited. They were only brought back from their daze after Richard coughed several times. Richard then asked, "We've given the toll, can you hand over the blood scythe card? Since I've already paid, I feel like a trip to Camp Bloodstone would be nice." The burly man put the gold coin in his pocket, making no effort to hide his greed as he spoke loudly, "No. 1 isn't enough, I want 2. No. 10 gold coins before I let you through." Isn't the tax per person 1 silver coin? How can it be inadequate? Richard asked, but he already knew the answer. It's 1 gold coin now, the burly man proclaimed. When did it rise? Richard asked. The burly man waved his double-edged axe with brute force and said, just a few moments ago, but. Another fighter walked up beside the burly man, poking him as he said, Boss. They have women. The burly man stared at him and angrily cried out, I don't care about women. We're here to collect tolls, not snatch girls. What kind of girls can't we find back at camp if we have money? Your brain is worthless. The man cowered in fear at the lash, but he continued to insist, Boss, these two are different. Please, look at them again. Only then did the burly man shift his gaze towards Richard's companions. This was a very interesting bunch of troops. Not only did they have 2 trolls, they had elves and more than 10 domesticated wolves. He obviously didn't know the difference between a wind wolf and a normal one. Even if he did not take them into consideration, Gangder was also someone who would demand attention due to his large physique and aura of dominance. His outer appearance would even make one wonder if he was a strong barbarian warrior. Apart from Gangder, the 3 novice knights from amongst the defected soldiers gave off awe-inspiring vibes as well. As for the 2 women in the party, Flozan and Waterflower, they were wrapped from head to toe in long white robes to protect them from the strong heat and the sun's glare. Even though their faces could not be seen clearly, their postures were graceful. His gaze then fell on Waterflower's legs. The young lady was still barefoot regardless of circumstance, and her snow-white legs stuck out from under the long robe. The tips of her feet were touching the ground lightly, as she stood there on the scorching sand and stone. Looking at her pearly white legs, the burly man's throat violently throbbed as he swallowed a large gulp of saliva. Richard reached back into his bag, grabbing a fistful of coins. However, the man waved him away. There's no rush to hand over the toll. Hey, ladies! Take off your robes and show me what you have. If you'll keep me company for a while, I won't collect any toll from your party. Waterflower's body slightly sunk down, as she spread open her 10 sparkling toes to get a firm grip on the ground. This was a sign that she was ready to strike. On the other hand, Richard let out a quick laugh and threw over 10 gold coins in the air, the light even covering the charm of her legs for a moment. The coins bumped into one another in the air, producing a melodious clang before they fell back into Richard's hand. Not a single one fell, displaying some of Richard's skill. With a crashing sound, Richard put all the gold coins back into his pouch. Smiling at the burly man, he asked, How should I address you? They call me Big Axe Sam. The burly man proudly proclaimed, even waving his large axe a few times. Gangder's expression turned ugly as he bowed his head slightly, glancing at his own big, thick axe. When he raised his head again, he shuffled his right foot in preparation to charge forward. Sam, I won't be paying the toll anymore. If you don't wish to die, please be loud in surrendering. Richard smiled and waved his hands, capture them all. If they struggle, there's no need to hesitate to kill. Just as he was done talking, a loud boom sounded as the party behind him surged forward. They threw themselves into the crowd, starting pure slaughter. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 59. A lucrative project, 2. Sam raised his large axe up high, but just as he started a battle cry, Waterflower had already passed by his side with a light hop off her toes. Her long white robe suddenly left her body, landing on his head like a cloud to cover it completely. Sam was startled, and hurriedly stuck out his hand to get the robe off. However, once he raised his hand, the back of his head was struck hard by the Shepherd of Eternal Rest. The young lady had struck him with the back of the blade, and with a dull thud the man's sturdy body fell straight to the ground even as the robe wrapped more tightly around his face. For a while, all he could feel was his head spinning as he saw stars all around him. He tried to get up in a panic, but another heavy blow struck his head which almost knocked the wind out of him. Following that, a barrage of attacks trampled his strong body, giving him the illusion that he'd fallen from a hill and was being trampled by a pack of mammoths. Richard, on the other hand, witnessed something else entirely. Once Waterflower got next to Sam and covered his head with her robe, she'd struck him down with the back of her blade. Afterwards, Gangder had rushed forward to punch and kick the man's face, followed closely by Medium Rare as the group launched a joint attack on this enemy. Watching the trio attack him viciously without touching any critical organs, he couldn't help but let out a resigned sigh and cover his eyes. He'd thought such tactics only belonged in the underworld before. The other side of the battle was different. A massacre ensued, as the troll magician cast out slows and various other curses. The elven bard boosted the spells with his own chants, leaving the two groups on completely different levels. Sam's troops were shocked to discover Richard's army was more ferocious than even them, and their coordination was on a completely different level to their own. Half of them were beaten in a flash, with some of the cavalry surrounded by wind wolves and cut to pieces from all directions. The battle was over quite quickly, and by the end of it all there were only 8 live captives including Sam. A few unlucky ones had been killed by accident, too slow to surrender. Sam remained as fierce as before, but he was beaten so badly he could barely even stand. Thus, Richard came into possession of more than 10 horses and a small camp. The knights skillfully cleaned up the battlefield, looking through the spoils of war along the way. There were several passes to bloodstone on Sam's body. It seemed like these troops really were only there to collect a toll before they grew greedy upon seeing Richard's money and the women of his party. Even as they were cleaning up, Ola wasted no time in interrogating the captives. He'd learned many interrogation and torture skills from Richard, and was exceptionally talented at their use. Perhaps a large contributor to that was the fact that he had no moral bottom line. On the other hand, Richard walked around the camp and the blockade, observing everything. He finally stopped in front of the simple barricades, pondering over some things silently. It took a while before he suddenly flashed Flozen a smile. "I just had a new idea. At least I know that we can make money off this land in the future." "Robbery would be fastest," Waterflower interjected as she passed him. Richard was startled, but to everyone's surprise he nodded. That's more or less what I thought of. At least in essence, that is." "You really want to steal?" Flozen was stunned. However, Richard knew that her only concern was whether the profits would match the risks they would take. "Robbery? That's a good way to make a living," Medium Rare said from not far away. Some of the people had puzzled expressions, with others skeptical and still more excited. Richard continued, "The idea is essentially the same. Let's set up roadblocks to collect tolls." Tolls? Everyone was left at a loss as to how this would be a profitable enterprise. This camp they just uprooted had almost nothing valuable, except the horses and perhaps the people themselves. Selling them off as slaves would be a way to turn a small profit. Richard had no plans to explain himself. This was only a preliminary idea, but he would have to wait for his power to extend throughout the bloodstained lands, before he used these roadblocks as a form of control. Wealth would flow freely then, and by his calculations the total income he stood to make was an extremely shocking figure. Looking at the captives, Richard could sense that everyone but Sam was terrified. The burly man had been beaten badly with his face covered, and the thuggy fight had left him feeling utterly humiliated. What's worse, he didn't even see how his underlings lost and died. Sam's men were fugitives, relying on instinct and fierceness to battle. On the other hand, everyone in Richard's army from Waterflower to his own knights to the surrendered ones were from the military or had been otherwise rigorously trained as killing machines. There was no room for comparison between an angry mob and an elite fighting force. Richard walked in front of the captives, taking out a white handkerchief to wipe his already pristine hands. He spoke slowly and politely, "All of you are under my charge from now. If anyone is thinking to exploit my kindness, do think of that pile of corpses over there that used to be your companions. My name is Richard R. Karen, and I will only show you grace this once. Attempt to revolt or escape, and only death awaits you. Moreover, I can promise you, he paused. The process will be slow and painful. The speech proved quite effective. Richard swept his eyes across the crowd, to see even Sam slightly cowering. He quickly glanced at the man before returning his gaze to his long, clean fingers. His hands were like a woman's, elegant and fair. They were also the source of various runes and spells. He wiped once more as he spoke gently, "Sam, I will always be watching you." These words sent a strange chill down the burly man's spine. He couldn't help but break out into a cold sweat. The troops quickly packed up and left. Richard and his core party now had horses, while the 9 captives walked. Zendral was especially quiet amongst the 8 from the blood-stained lands. He didn't look strong, but that strange deathly pale complexion with a tinge of cyan made him look like a zombie. Sam and the others subconsciously tried to keep their distance from the necromancer. Flozan and Richard walked shoulder to shoulder, her white cloak wrapping the whole of her body to leave only her amber eyes visible. She looked at Richard and let out a faint smile. "That went well, didn't it?" Richard couldn't help but nod as he asked, "How did you know that it would scare them?" "I'm an official of God," she replied. "The study of religion is also the study of the will of the people. Of course I know the kind of threats that would scare them." Looking at Richard's unrelenting gaze, Flozan knew that this was not an answer he would accept. Of course, she'd known that from the start. She spoke seriously, "Fugitives like these don't fear threats, and they're not afraid of blood. They don't even fear death. The only kinds of people they're afraid of are lunatics and maniacs." Richard snorted with an unnatural smile and continued to ask, "What else? What else?" Flozan's voice sounded like she was trying to hold in her laughter. "There is nothing else. I'm just telling you that you're suited to such a role, so they got scared of you, but..." "Suited? Suited for what? A lunatic or a maniac?" Richard raged, but controlled his volume in fear of letting the others hear him. Flozan bluntly said, "Both." Richard was at a loss for words. After what seemed like forever, he managed to stutter out, "What about you? What are you afraid of?" Flozan replied immediately, "A man who does not keep his promises." Richard was rendered speechless once more, but her words lingered on in his head. He felt there were so many things held inside them that hadn't been mentioned out loud. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 60. Ruffian. The army gradually made their way out, the dead warriors and horses left abandoned. This was a tradition of the bloodstained lands. Once the humans left, vultures, hyenas, and scavenging rats would feast on the corpses until only bone remained. It was considered the only way for the spirits of the dead to break away from the curse that plagued this land, moving on to the afterlife. The wind wolves were left behind as well. They needed food, and the horse carcasses would do. However, unlike the scavengers of the bloodstained lands, they would also eat the bones. Unless there wasn't enough food available, Richard wouldn't allow them to eat human remains. Camp Bloodstone finally came into view by the evening, although it was still distant. The place was in the middle of stony peaks, with a crude wall erected between the natural rock formations to form a barrier. There was a watchtower built on top of the camp, giving them extensive warning of anything that came their way. A skilled archer would be able to shoot down anything in the camp from this position. As the camp approached, the intelligence reports he'd acquired about it started to flow through Richard's mind. Camp Bloodstone was close to the fringe of the bloodstained lands, not far from the Sequoia Kingdom and the Blackwater Duchy. It was an important stronghold for both adventurers and caravans alike leaving from the human countries, but the permanent residents of the place only numbered about 2,000 people at most. At the limit, there could be as much as 5,000 people traveling in and out of the place, the limit of the 8 underground springs that provided the place with water. Of the 8 springs in Camp Bloodstone, 4 were under the control of a half-orc tribe called the Bloodstone Orcs. The remaining were split between 4 weaker points of power, with the Blood Scythe, Mark, being one of them. The head of the Bloodstone Orcs was called Stormhammer, and he was the most powerful person in the camp. The level 14 warrior was a force to be reckoned with, be it in his own capacity or due to the 100 ferocious half-orcs he controlled. His was an imposing presence, giving him a lot of say in Camp Bloodstone. Even in a human kingdom the half-orc would easily have been knighted, so in a small territory like Camp Bloodstone his status was a given. Mark the Bloodscythe, Sharon the Cyclops, Bowen the Lame, and Howie the Razor were the remaining 4 centers of power. Each of them had 100 soldiers themselves for the most part, individually ranging from level 12 to 14. Howie was a level 14 warrior himself, but rumors were abound that he would never dare challenge Stormhammer. Mark had now become Richard's first target. He was a fierce and cruel man, a level 13 warrior who fought with 2 heavy, enchanted short-handle scythes. Outside of his innate strength he possessed no special abilities, making him an easy target for Richard. With his current army, he had many ways of dealing with this man who was only high in level. As Richard was deep in thought, he subconsciously started wiping his spotless hands once more on horseback. He only stopped daydreaming when he caught a glimpse of Flozen holding back her laughter. After a moment of embarrassment, he suddenly figured out why and calmly put the handkerchief away. A few half-orcs stood guard at the camp's gate, and the arrival of Richard's army sent them into a small frenzy. After all, there were 2 conspicuous trolls and more than 10 windwolves amongst them, making for a formidable group. The most important thing was that Richard's group was made of unfamiliar faces, and it didn't look like a caravan. It was obvious from the formation that they weren't ordinary adventurers either, so their experience and intuition told the soldiers that this was a sign of trouble. "What are you here for?" the leader asked. Ola passed over the blood scythe pass to the man, pointing at Richard as he spoke. "My master would like to obtain some good wares from the barbarian plains, and we're here to try our luck. We've already paid the toll." This was a script they'd agreed to earlier. The half-orc leader looked at the pass, and then back at the crowd. He looked at Richard, who had a cold, arrogant expression on his face, before letting out 2 breaths. "Mark, that son of a bitch. There's no toll to enter Camp Bloodstone, and this pass is worthless without any benefits. That fellow is hated. I suggest you throw this pass in the trash. If you've already paid him, you're of no use to him unless you're willing to give him more." "Thank you, my friend," Ola said sincerely, handing over a few coins. The half-orc seemed to relax after taking the money, but he still spoke up. "Orcs and elves can never be friends, but I still wish you good luck. Go ahead." He then had the passage opened with a wave. A pungent odor assaulted the party's nostrils the moment they entered the camp. It was a mix of excrement, rotting food, trash, and the scent of slaves who had never showered. It stung hard, like a grade 6 acid fog. The party's expressions warped in disgust for a while, the 2 trolls being the most affected. They loved food the most, and their noses were particularly sensitive. There were buildings of varying heights all over the camp, their walls seemingly made of weathered red rock. It was obvious that not much thought had been given to the place's construction, the infrastructure likely formed over a long period of disorderly growth and territorial war. However, it was still relatively easy to tell the distribution of power amongst the springs, with tall walls separating the streets from the buildings whenever one was nearby. In the middle of the camp was a 5-story building that looked like a castle. Several sharp, wooden stakes extended into the sky from the walls, giving the structure a strong Orcish flair. There were several flags flying from the castle, a background of dark red with a warhammer dripping blood on the front. This was the flag of the Bloodstone Orcs. Outside of the castle, the other buildings in the camp had no style to speak of, especially so in the west, which was home to a large ghetto. The houses in the area were crudely built, the walls made of piled rocks and the roofs materials indiscernible. They were so short any adult human would have to bend down to enter, and it was unlikely the buildings would even survive the entrance of someone like Gengar or the trolls. The places was littered with garbage and stale water, so many flies buzzing around they were like black clouds hovering on top. As Richard was passing by a small alley, he happened to witness a few shabbily dressed but fierce-looking men surrounding a sack on the floor. They were relentlessly punching and kicking the sack, and one of them was even attacking with a spiked wooden club. Every hit left a dark stain on the sack's surface. The sack twisted and turned, leaving an indistinct sound coming from within. It likely contained a human given the size, but the people surrounding it were unrelenting in their attacks, harboring an intent to kill. Richard stopped his horse, sweeping his gaze over the attackers as he frowned without saying a word. These people were just ordinary folk, but they were committing such violence in public without remorse that their insane thirst for blood made him feel a little uncomfortable. If this craziness was rampant throughout the bloodstained lands, he would have to adjust his conquest to accommodate. He would have to make the kind of adjustments Flozen had in mind. The men realized they were being watched, stopping to turn around and stare at Richard. They were skinny and dirty, with no physical strength to speak of, but their bloodshot eyes made them look very fierce. It was obvious that Richard's party outnumbered them, and the two trolls looked formidable at first glance, but this did not deter them at all. One of them even raised his head and shot Richard a look of contempt, the provocation in it obvious. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 61. Ruffian, 2. These people were a bunch of rabid dogs. Even with a dragon standing in front of them, they would still jump forward and try to take a bite or two first. An older man took 2 steps forward, tapping the bloodstained spiky club in his hand as he spoke menacingly, "Oi kid, there's nothing fun to watch here." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, as he pointed out 2 men and said lightly, "I hate those eyes. And this old fellow has clearly lived too long." But he'd barely finished speaking when Waterflower appeared in front of the first in a flash. She stuck her 2 fingers in, gouging his eyes out in a flash without mercy. At the same time, the ground shook as Medium Rare rushed forward with large strides, his hammer twirling around. A dull bang echoed in the air. He'd hammered the old fellow who was brandishing his club into the wall, reducing him to a ball of flesh and blood that could barely be recognized as once human. Looking at the bloodshed, fear finally flashed on the faces of the other 3 men. They turned to escape, but a bowstring resonated thrice in a row. Ola had responded to Richard's gestured command, sending an arrow through their backs. The 3 men were rendered motionless, collapsing at once. A few of the impoverished commoners nearby slowly straightened themselves. From the looks of it, they seemed to be the ones who lived in the shacks nearby. They'd paid no heed to the violence before, but the toughness of these foreigners seemed to finally stir something in them. An old man with grizzled hair stared at Richard, saying slowly, "You have formidable power, sir, but you should not abuse it." Another robust middle-aged man spoke broodingly, "This is Bowen's territory, and we are his subordinates. He isn't to be messed around with." He crossed his hands over his chest as he spoke, gripping tightly to have his fingers crackle. Richard didn't say anything, merely pointing at the ladder. Gangder took big bounds over, landing a ruthless punch on the man's face. The hammer-like fist distorted his figure, blood and teeth falling out of his mouth as the sturdy fellow was sent flying into the wall. He collapsed into the dark, humid shack, not a sound to be heard from him again. Gangder maintained his fighting stance, grinning in a display of his pearly white teeth to everyone nearby before he gradually pulled his fists back and returned to Richard's troops. Richard's piercing gaze fell on the elderly man, its intensity making him feel throbs of stabbing pain that forced him 2 steps back. It was only then that Richard spoke in a detached tone, "The use of power is in being able to gouge out the eyes of crazed dogs that glare at you. If any mongrel still wants to bite, I'll kill them all." Richard looked at the man once more, continuing, "To me, you're all no different from crazed dogs. The only humans are the ones hiding in their shacks." As for Bowen the Lame, Richard glanced at the middle-aged man who landed into the shack. "He's not to be trifled with, sure, but that applies even more so to me. Does anyone still wish to say anything?" Richard's gaze swept past the entire ghetto, and this time everyone subconsciously avoided his gaze without the guts to make any more comments. Once they entered Camp Bloodstone proper, Richard chose a decent inn to settle down at that was under Stormhammer's sphere of governance. Unlike the other regions, this place was clearly safer. The half-orcs had built this camp, which meant that under most circumstances they could firmly uphold order. And thus, the price was also correspondingly high. Even 20 gold church coins only got Richard and his party a lodging of 20 days. Camp Bloodstone had inns, barracks, casinos, taverns, and other facilities. There were also over 10 slave camps and an arena that could accommodate an audience of hundreds of people. The arena was the prime entertainment at Camp Bloodstone, and Stormhammer's greatest source of wealth. The ring was open when they arrived, so after dinner Richard brought everyone along to watch a match. Slaves and fighters of different backgrounds engaged in battle here, turning it into a place where those in power resolved their conflicts covertly. Richard was going so he could estimate the power of the fighters in Bloodstone. For the price of 2 gold coins, he booked a compartment on the second level, surrounded by other similar viewing platforms. By the time he settled down in his seat, the entirety of the arena was almost full. Everyone in the crowd was standing, their bodies pressed against each other. The bustling noise almost threatened to tear the roof apart, but the murky atmosphere had reached its peak. Strangely enough, this mix of hormones, adrenaline, and blood in the air slowly and continuously strengthened the bloodlust in the crowd. Clang. Clang, two loud crashes echoed from the platform on Richard's left, capturing his attention. A short yet sturdy man had thrown his crutches on the railing of the platform, using his hands to maneuver his body as he threw himself into the wide and cozy chair and let out a breath of satisfaction. The crutches were solid and sturdy, seemingly made entirely out of steel. There was a row of burly guards behind the man, and they were clearly not weak at all. That man turned his head around and offered a brilliant smile to Richard before saying, "I am Bowen, but the people here all call me Bowen the Lame." Richard R. Karen. Bowen continued to beam and asked, "So it's Mr. Richard. I wonder where you come from. If I am not mistaken, you should be a respected noble, Richard replied indifferently, "My family does have nobility, but I know my title is of no use in this land. I have no intention of using it to get anything either. My sword will get me what I want." Well said. Bowen praised and continued, "In this cursed red land, you can only use your fists and swords to fight for your say. Those nobles who arrive here thinking otherwise mostly end up as a target for robbers or foreign creatures. But your guards all look very powerful." It's not just the looks. This afternoon, they even tested their abilities out and cleared a few crazed dogs, Richard corrected with a smile. "Is that so? What a coincidence. I lost a few dogs myself." Bowen responded with a laugh. A ferocious glint then flashed in his eyes, and he remarked meaningfully, "Could Mr. Richard give me an explanation for this coincidence?" Explanation? Richard finally turned his head and looked straight into Bowen's eyes, unfazed. "You sent a few crazed dogs to test my capability and power, and I hacked them to death. This should tell you enough that I'm more powerful than you. What's there to explain about such a simple matter? Don't tell me you're really foolish enough to want to attack me. Try, and it won't be as simple as your teeth being knocked out. The hyenas might not even have a chance to nibble at your bones." Bowen's expression darkened slightly before he burst into loud laughter. "Mr. Richard is not tactful at all. This isn't exactly the conduct of a respectable noble, Richard retorted, "You're saying you still know the meaning of the word tactful after having lived so long in the Bloodstained lands?" Bowen stared blankly and pondered for a moment before nodding. "Looks like Mr. Richard will have a pleasant stay here, unlike me. Those poor fellows in the ghettos rely on me for a living. But I only lost a few dogs. I've heard that the Blood Scythe lost a few family pets. One of them was even taken away. I reckon he's already enraged by now. You're a foreigner, so you should be careful." Richard nodded and replied indifferently, "If he's smart enough, he'll know what he should and shouldn't do." Mark never seemed wise. Bowen continued to probe. Richard stretched a little and leaned further into the back of his chair. After he got into a comfortable position, he spoke slowly and deliberately. They say fools die early. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 62. Gamble. Right at that moment, a bell rang out from the arena. A loud host stepped out, an energetic dwarf with a fiery red beard. Behind him were two naked women, bodies smeared with glistening oil from head to toe, making them look like gems dipped in dew. They paraded out in all sorts of poses to the tune of the dwarf's exaggerated yells. At the same time, more than 10 people started to make rounds through the ring, taking bets from the crowd. Young ladies of various ethnicities made way to their positions in the various compartments on the second level. Outside of basic services like food and drink, they would provide some key services. When matches got to the most gory part, for example, a few guests grew so hysterical and animalistic that they pinned these girls down and took them on the spot. The ring was an open arena with a diameter of about 20 meters. It was less than a meter deep, surrounded by low walls that were about half a meter high. However, this minimal protection was one of the attractions. There would be incidents of accidental gore in the places nearest to the ring during some very intense matches. The compartments on the second level were already fully occupied. Bowen, Sharon, Mark, and Howie were all present in their compartments, Stormhammer the only one who was nowhere to be seen. Richard took the chance to observe the blood scythe a little longer. The man was humongous, with muscles as sturdy as steel and a layer of thick black hair covering his chest. His shirt left the chest bare, as if to display a medal for show. It seemed like he was of barbarian, if not Orcish, descent. Separated by a single compartment, Mark was glowering at Richard from the start. Richard had only turned to him after his exchange with Bowen. Unlike Mark, who looked so menacing he was on the verge of leaping forward to kill at any time, Richard was calm and collected. The corner of his gaze rested on this upcoming opponent, not letting any detail slip him by. Be it Mark's glares, roars, or obscene gestures, Richard simply continued to keep an eye on the blood scythe and do nothing else. The more elaborate the man's motions grew, the more details his numeric vision would grant him. The blood scythe was eventually unable to withstand Richard's passive gaze. He cursed viciously under his breath, turning his own to the ring. As unrestrained and crazy as he was, he would not openly disturb order by getting into a fight with the outsider on the viewing platforms. That would be a display of defiance towards Stormhammer, the most powerful man in the camp. Of course, it would be another matter altogether if the outsider was provoked first, but unfortunately that did not happen. The matches had already begun, for human slaves being pit against a starving dire bear. The battle quickly turned bloody as the bear clawed into the warrior's chest, slicing all the way down his body. A moment later, the wild beast had tackled the rest to the ground and was chewing them up to its heart's content right in front of the crowd. Blood flowed, and organs shattered. The gore only hyped up the crowd, as the cheering intensified. The crowd was so pumped up that they could barely find a way to vent their adrenaline, and as they jostled against one another, an unlucky fellow was pushed over the wall and into the ring by accident. This quickly got the attention of the bear, which pounced on him amidst screams of despair and took half his head off with a single swipe. The audience didn't so much as flinch, continuing to jostle as they were overcome by another clamorous cheer. The battles continued, one after the other. After a few rounds, warriors with background began to take part in the battles, and two of the leaders even pitted their men against each other directly. From the matchups, it seemed like Bowen and Sharon were at odds, while Howie had some urgent conflict with Stormhammer. Although the Bloodstone Orcs had lost, they left a deep impression with their strength. On the other hand, Mark didn't seem to be on good terms with anyone. When a dark-skinned man working under the blood scythe stepped into the ring, Richard called over the waitress and tossed a gold coin onto the tray in her hand. He gestured to the dark-skinned fighter, "I bet that he'll lose this round." An outsider who'd directly entered the second level was already a focus of attention, but the radiance of the gold coin just intensified that. There wasn't even an opponent in the ring yet, but Richard had immediately bet on the man losing. It was clear that this was deliberately targeted at someone, and it caused an instant uproar within the ring as people began to engage in animated discussions. Mark shot daggers at Richard with his eyes in response. However, he wasn't as chatty as before. He didn't say anything. The battle ended very quickly, the dark-skinned warrior winning without much ado. Richard could already tell that he was a level 10 warrior gifted with innate strength, while his opponent was only level 8 without anything special whatsoever. The victory was actually a given. Mark glared harshly at Richard, before letting out a smug roar. He then grabbed hold of a waitress and dragged her over, pinning her against the railing. Ripping her skirt off ruthlessly, he forcefully entered her body and began thrusting vigorously. Richard smiled for a moment before calling his waitress over. He gestured towards the dark-skinned man once more. I bet he'll lose the next round. 10 gold coins leapt into the tray, and as they fell in they didn't just grab the crowd's attention this time. Mark's manhood was brought to a strangling halt, as he momentarily forgot what he was doing. He snapped out of his reverie in an instant, however, and realized what was happening. The instant, tremendous humiliation drowned out his sense of reason, and he pushed the young lady away before pointing at Richard. I want to bet against you. Do you dare have someone battle my Black Reaper? I'll bet just as much money as you. Richard gave a reserved smile. At this moment, his expression reflected his status as a true blue aristocrat, a state of absolute grace coupled with a faint arrogance of leadership that was not displeasing to the eye. What an excuse for guts. I thought you'd say you'll bet many times what I do, but it turns out it's only 1-1. Mark's face reddened instantly, and turned purple the next moment. He had already tightened his grip around the short sides that made him famous, and in the next moment, booming laughter drowned out everything else. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 63. Gamble, 2. Richard turned to look at the people behind him, asking, who wants to go down and play? Waterflower, Gangder, and the trolls had no intention of moving. This battle posed no real challenge for them, and the girl additionally didn't like to put on performances. If anyone wanted to watch her perform, she would gouge out their eyes. One of the foot soldiers took a step forward, saying in a low voice, I'll go. Richard nodded and said, don't end it too quickly. The foot soldier immediately understood what Richard meant, and in a confident and cruel way stated, don't worry, my lord. I will ensure the battle goes on long enough. This was a battle without requirements or restrictions. Both sides could use their own weapons and armor. The Black Reaper chose 2 axes, while the much smaller soldier chose light armor, a small square shield, and a dagger. This immediately gave rise to hisses of displeasure from the audience. The ring preferred blood to the clash of metal, and warriors with such complete defensive equipment were rare. Regardless of how the audience opposed this, the match officially began with the roars from the host. The Black Reaper pounced at the soldier from the start, his axes hacking down like a gale as he showered the man with successive strikes. The soldier was like a boat in a storm amidst his resounding roars, seemingly about to capsize at any moment. However, while he was constantly pushed back and seemed to be on the verge of reaching the end, he was always able to narrowly get through the attacks. The storm of attacks had left the steel shield completely deformed, and his armor had a couple of cracks as well. Unlike the Black Reaper's axes, the dagger was so small it looked like a toy. Thankfully the 2 weapons never clashed, so it was still intact. However, his opponent had suffered quite a few injuries as well. The foot soldier had constantly managed to find the time to counterattack from the midst of his defense, using extremely tricky angles that left long, thin wounds on his target's body. These tiny injuries did nothing to affect the Black Reaper's battle capabilities. On the contrary, they only made him more fierce. The powerful movements and heart-shaking bellows would make anyone feel restless as they felt their blood pumping. Even Mark, who'd already lifted his pants back up, had thrown himself at the railing, waving his arms with full strength as his roars resounded even louder than his fighter's own. All he wished was for himself to be in the ring, using his heavy sides to chop that foot soldier into pieces and throw them at Richard's face. Seeing the Black Reaper losing golden opportunities to thoroughly defeat his opponent time and time again, his anxiety peaked repeatedly. Mark had already immersed himself in the battle, unable to see many details. It couldn't be helped, however. Richard had taken out a staggering 50 gold coins, and those were church coins at that. While he wouldn't have to lose his pants for this, it still was comparable to a few months of his income. Folks like him who'd only risen up in the past few years had pitifully meager savings. In the meanwhile, Sharon shifted to Bowen's side. Practically stretching his head over the viewing platform, he asked, "Hey old man, do you see anything with that Richard's subordinate?" Bowen answered with another question, "What have you discerned?" Sharon chuckled, knowing that this was the man's typical behavior. His movements are short and effective, not sloppy in the slightest. He's firm and radiant, and doesn't seem to feel anything at the sight of blood. That's completely different from our guys who go crazy with their bloodlust. Bowen looked at the noble youth viewing the match with interest, saying slowly, "He's a true veteran. If he was in an army, he would have at least 500 soldiers under him." Sharon twitched his lips, looking in Richard's direction. "You can't judge a veteran's power from their rank. Take a look. It isn't just one fellow like that next to Mr. Richard." Bowen looked to be deep in thought. "It seems like Mark will be in trouble soon." Sharon nodded. "Whatever it is, this is good. However, this Mr. Richard really doesn't know how to hide his wealth. Even I'm feeling something after seeing all those gold coins." Bowen, however, sneered, "But what if his original intention was for you to feel something?" Sharon's expression changed, and he silently thought it over for a while. He then glanced over, finding that many people's gazes were filled with fervor and greed as they watched Richard. However, the man himself seemed oblivious and merely watched the battle keenly. The match had gone on for a whole 10 minutes, and by now the Black Reaper was panting hard. His roars had dulled and he'd grown dispirited, and although his axes were still powerful, his quivering muscles were proof that he was nearing his limits. He blocked fewer and fewer attacks, the dagger increasingly making contact with skin and leaving behind wound after wound on his body. Mark suddenly stopped shouting, because even he had realized something was off here. The Black Reaper was showing even more of his weaknesses, but the foot soldier still was as guarded as he had been at the beginning, finding opportunities to retaliate and keep leaving little wounds behind on his body. There were a few opportunities to send his dagger into the hilt, but he gave them up and chose to pare off some skin. The Black Reaper already had tens of wounds on his body, and every one of them continued to bleed. He left behind blood-stained footprints with every step he took. All of a sudden the foot soldier quickened the pace of his attacks, and the style kept changing. Each time the dagger attacked, a thin layer of flesh would be skinned off from his opponent, leaving the man howling in agony. The bloody footprints on the ground soon grew more pronounced, and a mist of blood dispersed in the air. Such brutal tactics immediately gave rise to a new merriment in the match. By the time the foot soldier swept at the Black Reaper's throat to end his drawn-out misery, the ring was burning with energy once more. He then straightened his body, loudly striking his shield with the dagger before he turned to Richard, arms raised high to proclaim victory. There were a few injuries on him as well, and some were even long and deep, but none were fatal. They wouldn't even affect his abilities. Receiving injuries properly was a basic yet important element of experience. The foot soldier's eyes were clear and direct, seemingly unperturbed by the cheers. The reason he had showed a victor's pose was actually merely to match with Richard's aim of suppressing Mark. Just as the foot soldier accepted the cheers for the victor, he suddenly sensed a trace of danger. Richard's own expression rapidly changed, mouth opening and closing as if yelling something to him. An instinct born of years in battle instantly surfaced, and he went low and covered his back with his shield. A heavy force rammed into the shield, a short steel spear. The thing had so much force behind it that it made its way through the metal, burying itself deep into the soldier's shoulder and re-emerging from his chest. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 64. Gamble, 3. Richard immediately stood up, his face darkening. A warrior in leather armor was taking out a second spear in preparation to attack once more, but two rays of holy light flashed past the arena to fall on the soldier. One was a greater heal, while the other was a protective spell similar to a magical shield. Another ray of light shone on the man after the first two had passed, augmenting his long-range defenses, a spell cast by Tiramisu. The entire arena was shocked by the 3 consecutive rays of light. All the high-ranked warriors knew exactly what that meant. Richard had a mage and someone of faith under him. And looking at the negligible time span between the two holy spells, it had to be a priest at minimum. Even at level 12, priests in Failure had great position in society, and in battle they were even more useful than the level 14 Stormhammer. As for a mage of the same level, their status would surpass even the priests. The assailant was intimidated, blanking out for a moment. It was only then that he remembered that his previous blow had not been fatal, and with the greater heal that had just come in, the enemy's combat abilities would not be affected if they recuperated well. He raised his arm in preparation once more, but the slight hesitation had forever lost him the chance. A sharp whistle rang through the arena as Gangder's axe whistled through the air. A numbing rip sounded as it crashed into the man, instantly cutting him diagonally in two. 3 spectators within range of the axe were killed as well, before it finally dug deep into one of the rock platforms. Even after the axe stopped, the handle was still buzzing. Richard suddenly turned his head to look at Bowen, asking, "Who's dut?" Bowen had wanted to delay his per-usual practice, but seeing Richard's charming smile, he nearly jumped out of his chair, as if he'd been drenched by cold water. "Marks," he answered as fast as he could. Richard nodded, and a fireball instantly shot towards Mark's compartment. All of a sudden, the entire arena fell into chaos. "It's another mage. Oh no, run. It's a fireball." Fireballs were much more effective in enclosed spaces, and although they weren't much of a threat to high-ranking warriors, they were fatal to commoners. Mark's face distorted under the onslaught of flames, and surging fire soon engulfed the blood scythe and filled every bit of space in the room, even overflowing back outside. A painful groan sounded from within, and the wall at the back exploded to reveal a path outside. Half of the platform crumbled from the wall, crashing into the chaotic crowd below. Richard snorted, sitting down slowly. That escape was quick. Gangder had already brought 2 knights to charge into the arena, carrying their wounded comrade back to Richard's room, where treatment immediately began. None of the guards dared interfere with his actions. The 2 mages and priest were more than sufficient intimidation. The ground level had become a mess, with people pushing one another in a fight to rush to the exit. On the other hand, the second level was very quiet. Outside of Mark's men, who had all fled, Howie, Sharon, and Bowen remained calmly in their seats with their gazes fixed on Richard. However, even they had some uneasiness and fear on their faces. Richard hadn't even displayed his full power, but had already put heavy pressure on them. Richard took out a white handkerchief and began wiping his hands, seemingly to wipe away the ashes from the fireball. However, the magical flames of the spell left no ash behind at all. The expressions of the 3 leaders changed slightly after seeing Richard's actions. This was in fact a strategy Flozan had taught Richard, using iconic actions to greatly intensify the other party's impressions of him and conveying his emotions through physical cues. Richard spoke indifferently as he was cleaning his hands. "You're smart, Mr. Bowen, and I like smart people. Maybe we can work together on some matters in the future."